Well, hello everybody, wherever and whichever time zone you're logging in from, and welcome virtually to London, to the Courtauld and to the Centre for American Art. I'm David Peters Corbett, the director of the Centre, which exists to support and develop research in the field of American art of all periods, broadly defined, and from the earliest moment to the present day, and in its international, transnational and global context. I'm very happy to welcome you to this two-day conference, Relationality in American Art. Just before we start, I'd like to thank Dr. Elizabeth Bowie, who is the organizer of the conference and whose brainchild it is, as well as our outstanding speakers over the next 2 days. I'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, whose continuing support enables the Center for American Art to put on its extensive program of in-person and virtual events, including this conference. Finally, as well, I'm grateful as always to the Courtauld's Research Forum team, who are with us to oversee the technical side of the event with their customary professionalism and calmness. It's a great pleasure now to turn to Elizabeth, who's on the screen as well, for an academic introduction to the conference.
Okay, thank you, David. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'd like to acknowledge my gratitude as well to David Peters Corbett for offering the space to put on this conference, to the Courtauld Center for American Art and the Terra Foundation for their support, to all our speakers for the labor that they put into their wonderful talks for today and tomorrow. And last but not least, I'd like to reiterate my thanks as well to the Research Forum, who's done a brilliant job of helping us with this conference. So I'm going to offer a brief introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. All right, so I'm going to just introduce what's going to happen in the conference first. So today's schedule will be as follows. After my brief remarks, I will introduce the moderator for our first panel, which is called Intersubjectivity and the Politics of Viewing. Then after a short break at 5:55 London time, we'll begin the second panel, Reorientations Toward the Landscape. We'll then have another short break today, before a concluding keynote talk by artist Caitlin Cherry, and that will be at 7 p.m. London time. That will be the end of today's schedule. I also invite you to join us tomorrow, beginning at the same time, 4:30 p.m. in London, for a shorter day consisting of a third panel called Agency, Subjectivity, and the Relations of Collective Experience, and a keynote presentation by Jennifer Doyle. In advance of her talk, she has offered us the opportunity to do a bit of optional homework by reading Life in the Iron Mills, a 1861 short story. And you can find links to this text as both an ebook and as an audiobook on the conference schedule, which is published on the Courtauld Research Forum's website. For all of our panels, the 3 papers will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A, at which point we'll address questions for all 3 of the speakers. So now I will begin my introductory remarks. 4 silhouetted bodies frame a swooping ray and a rather enormous speckled grouper in the American artist Mabel Dwight's 1936 lithograph Queer Fish. These buoyant and illuminated creatures at first seem a world away from their human counterparts, whose weighty volumes Dwight sheathed in dark gray. The key relation would seem to be between the bald man and the fish in front of him. Eyes locked, they exchanged penetrating glances. Dwight linked these 2 figures in other ways, too. The grouper's fin spans a column of white bubbles as if to caress the man's jacket. Its gaping mouth finds a corollary in the concavity of the man's hat and the hanging chain draped across his middle. Pudgy man meets pudgy fish. It was a, quote, very funny psychological moment, the artist later wrote. Then both swam away, end quote. Indeed, Dwight is lauded for the charm of gently satirical works like this one, her most popular print. Who is the subject of this print and who is its object? Dwight was interested in this question too. For her, the aquarium's inhabitants were the primary observers. As she put it, quote, pop-eyed fish swim around in circles and stare at the public, end quote. Queer Fish turns just on this inversion of normative protocols between observer and observed, and therein lies its claim to popular humor. What interests me most about this work, though, is that its formal intelligence seems to destabilize these categorizations in the first place, and to propose in their place sets of shifting and multifaceted relations. Just as I accommodate myself to homing in on the man-grouper pair, I notice that the man's body is turned toward the picture plane and so opens the scene to bodies positioned outside its frame. Are we aquarium visitors too? Or do we look at this scene as a work of art through the vitrine marked out by the print's margins? The growing web of relations that this widening perspective encourages is underscored by another print of the New York Aquarium called Aquarium or Fish of 1928, positioned from almost precisely the same vantage. Dwight's familiar figures are now enmeshed in a crowd. The curving bounds of the grouper and the ray marked out so clearly in Queer Fish fractured into a flurry of orange. This brief analysis of Dwight's print is pretty straightforward. Even so, it departs from standard readings in which the work is not taken to transcend social satire. Acknowledging the matrix of relations embedded in its formal structure opens onto questions that we might not otherwise ask of early American modernism, say, or of prints that circulated widely, as Dwight's did. These questions would include, how does an artist's articulation of the boundedness of the body, of a fish or of a man, open it to corporeal and affective relations with other bodies, things, and environments? Does the rupture in aquarium of the eye contact foregrounded in Queer Fish displace into other sensorial registers the certainty and the violence of knowing by looking? Is it only through this web of multifaceted and sensorial relations that these selves are animated, rather than by a private interiority or consciousness, as modernism would have it? On this last question, we might compare New York Movie of 1939 by Edward Hopper, Dwight's colleague from the Whitney Studio Club's life drawing classes. Here, the private experience of viewing a film, even when staged as communal experience, is allegorized by the psychological space of the usherette, eyes closed, lost in thought. Dwight, by contrast, seems to positively insist on multiple positionalities and vantages in her densely populated scenes of aquariums, hat sales, movie theaters, life drawing classes, zoos, hospital clinics, and Harlem apartment parties. In Queer Fish, we are beside the man, who is in turn beside the fish. These relations are characterized not by hierarchy, but by adjacency. The reversibility of these positions of sensing and being sensed suggest that intersubjectivity is intercorporeal, embodied as well as contingent. This kind of relational analysis of bodily position and the intellectual construction of space is indebted to theories of perception that aim to explain how beholders engage with the things that they perceive. And this is at the core of phenomenology, or the study of the structures of consciousness. The phenomenology of the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty in particular has been especially useful to artists and art historians in the 20th century. In Merleau-Ponty's writing and teaching of the 1940s and 50s, he addressed what he saw as a fundamental problem with Western philosophy's understanding of the human subject. He argued that subject and object were not separate entities, but reciprocally intertwined, and that this sensory exploration invested perceiver and perceived with humanity. Since art history is, after all, predicated on the study of relations between bodies, artworks and forms, and their contexts or communities, Merleau-Ponty's theory offered an inroads for art history to align with intellectual currents that challenged empiricism and that were indebted to an artwork's social situation. A second key tenet of Merleau-Ponty's theory is that perception is not simply visual, but involves the whole body. For this reason, understanding human experience as embodied and therefore specifically identified, Merleau-Ponty's theory helps us understand how our experience of visual images and objects informs who we are. Beyond Merleau-Ponty's own writing on the painting of Matisse and Cézanne, among others, his work has only occasionally intersected directly with American art. American art history has taken the principal site of this crossing to be minimalist art of the 1960s, immediately following the 1962 translation into English of Merleau-Ponty's 1945 Phenomenology of Perception. My own research for my book Beside Painting, which is one of the seeds that germinated into this conference, has shown that American artists in Paris were working alongside phenomenologists in the 1950s, actually, simply absorbing phenomenology in French before its English translation. In the minimalist context, Robert Morris stripped down works like his L beams, which you see here of 1965, to the barest compositional relationships. The beams are large enough that they could not be apprehended in a single glance, but require the circumnavigation of the viewer in the gallery space, thus making the work's salient relation external, that between the work and the beholder, rather than internal, such as the arrangement of shapes within an easel picture. Critics Rosalind Krauss, Michael Fried, and Annette Michelson theorized minimalism at the moment of its emergence with great consequence for the trajectory of high modernism, while art historians James Meyer, Stephen Melville, Alex Potts, and Claire Bishop have since detailed its historical implications. Beyond this well-worn critical context and in alignment with the decentering regime of postmodernism, phenomenology returned in critical discourses such as film and feminist studies, in retrospective histories of installation art and body art in the 1990s, and implicitly in relational aesthetics. Perhaps no scholar has done more to chart phenomenology's intellectual cross-currents with visual art than Amelia Jones, who has argued that Merleau-Ponty provides a crucial model of, quote, understanding the process through which we determine meaning and identity. His model indicates precisely that these determinations are never fixed, but rather always fluid, end quote. Jones has written of the profound influence of Hegel's master-slave dialectic on 20th century models of subjectivity. While I have briefly traced relationality through phenomenology's imbricated models of subjectivity, it's notable for our purposes that the master-slave model of subjectification informed not only Merleau-Ponty, but also Simone de Beauvoir and Frantz Fanon, who developed their own oppositional models of identity formation addressing gender and sexuality, and race and nationalism, respectively, opening relational approaches to account for difference in ways that Merleau-Ponty has been critiqued for ignoring. Further, the seminal post-colonial theorist Edward Glissant, about whose philosophy of relation we will hear more in Kate Keohane's talk, studied with Merleau-Ponty and other phenomenologists at the Sorbonne. In this introduction, and to a certain extent in the conference, my choice to route relationality through phenomenology owes to its capacity to speak to difference. A guiding question has been, how can relationality reconfigure how we understand American art beyond the inflection points and critical discourses I mentioned earlier, even if under different names? So, the 1960s, the 1990s, and now. Phenomenology seems to return every 30 years or so to undergird new theoretical configurations that resist structural terms of simplistic binaries. So where does this leave us in 2021? Before turning to the conference to offer answers to this question, my last task is to gesture towards some of the work by scholars who have mobilized relational models of identification involving relationality, intersectionality, hybridity, and affect, alongside queer, post-colonial, and feminist concepts of subjectivity. In the field of trans theory, Gail Solomon has explored the usefulness of the body's epistemological uncertainty for non-normative gender identifications. For her, a quote, body becomes so by virtue of its interaction with what surrounds it, not because of a stuff that is radically foreign to its surroundings. In Crip studies, Alison Kafer proposes a relational model in which, quote, the problem of disability no longer resides in the minds or bodies of individuals, but in built environments and social patterns that exclude particular kinds of bodies, minds, and ways of being, end quote. Returning then to Queer Fish, we continue to unpack the assumptions in it that separate subject and object, a separation predicated on the extractive, empiricist, and colonialist logic of othering that Dwight's prints foreground. Relationality offers an opportunity to investigate these assumptions as they intersect with our study of visual art and to offer new theoretical frameworks. as Remy Mize does in her paper for today, drawing from the Lakota belief that all life forms, human and non-human, are endowed with personhood and united in kinship networks involving mutual respect. Continuing to take seriously the interpretive possibilities of relational theories, we might take literally, rather than idiomatically, Queerfish's title, to take queer as an indicator, as Jennifer Doyle has written, to mean, quote, not only those desires that can be described as same-sex, but those who simply can't live happily within the heteronormative matrix. Or drawing from disability studies relational models, what would it mean to investigate the sensory dimensions of seeing, hearing, and feeling underwater, alongside the knowledge that Dwight herself was deaf? I will end my methodological speculations here, as I am out of time. So in conclusion, like other capacious terms of recent art historical investigation, such as circulation or scale, relationality risks losing definitional contours so as to seemingly pertain to everything. My brief remarks today outline certain facets of its history to offer a ground that we might continue to interrogate and challenge from within that tradition and especially from outside of it. To that end, any footpath we make toward understanding relationality in American art exists not to forge a history within avant-gardist models of supersession that are themselves binary, but as a different frame for understanding art of the long 20th century. And relationality is therefore an eloquent testimony to the ways that history is constantly recast. So with that, thank you all so much for your attention. I will now invite you to join me in welcoming the moderator for our first panel, Carol Bourne-Taylor. So Carol Bourne-Taylor is a fellow and a tutor in French at Brasenose College, Oxford. Her research interests gravitate towards phenomenologically inspired overlapping topics in literature in French and English, as well as the performing arts. So over to you now, Carol.
I am delighted to act as moderator of this panel on intersubjectivity and the politics of viewing. We have an eclectic set of papers to look forward to, very much in the wake of Elizabeth's presentation of phenomenology as an endlessly shifting and shiftable method. I should like to remind our speakers to stick to their allocated time. I shall be collecting questions from the chat box. And no doubt they will generate, these papers, these inspiring papers, will generate a lot of responses. Our first speaker is Louise Siddens, a Fulbright Fellow at the Eccles Center for American Studies at the British Library. She is also a professor of art history at Oklahoma State University, specializing in American art and the marginalized visual cultures of modernity. Louise is currently working on a book about Laura Gilpin, queerness, and the visual politics of Navajo sovereignty. The title of Louise's paper is Intimate Relations, Touch and Gaze Across Media in the Collaborative Portraits of Laura Gilpin and Brenda Putnam. Louise?
This talk is drawn from the first chapter in my forthcoming book that Carol just mentioned on the American lesbian photographer Laura Gilpin, which examines intersections between lesbian and Navajo sovereignty politics in the middle of the 20th century, before Stonewall and before Red Power hit the mainstream press. My research has always had its roots in my personal experience, but as a queer woman who's lived in Oklahoma, stolen land formerly known as Indian Territory and the current home of 39 Native tribes and nations, for 12 years, this book has been particularly poignant to research and write. Often, I feel the line between Gilpin and myself blurring, and as I collaborate with Dene colleagues, I wonder if they feel about me as hers did about her. But this is queer history in a nutshell. It's a history of feeling as well as of fact, which also happens to be a strength of art history as a discipline. Our objects of study are intentionally indescribable, but we know them when we see them. This chapter asserts the certainty that comes not just from sight, but also from touch. But it began with a daydream, which is where I'll begin again now. I'm lying in bed, listening to the opening paragraphs of Anne Lamott's classic writing guide, Bird by Bird, when my senses are overtaken by a feeling, I almost said a memory, of my fingers running along Laura's marble spine. Brenda Putnam sculpted this portrait of her friend in the summer of 1929. At this moment, I know it only from a series of photographs, which is also how I know Gilpin herself. As that realization percolates through my sleepy mind, the line between seeing and knowing blurs into haptic awareness of Laura's marmoreal form. I accept this. My gentle touch is electric against skin made cold by careful climate control, and it feels as though someone should stop me. We're in a museum, after all, and she's art. But no one does, so I give in to a frenzy of touch, my palms running along the length of her body, squeezing her curves as though I expect my fingers to be able to sink into her flesh, and clambering onto her plinth so that not only my hands, but my arms and thighs and belly can feel what it's like to have her body against mine. My touch slowly warms her, and as we lie together, I wonder about her previous lovers. First, her biographer, Marnie Sandveiss, who asked probing questions about Laura's life, relationships, and even this sculpture, but chose to keep her in the closet. Second, her lifelong love, Betsy Foster. How did she feel about reports of Laura's nude double on display in downtown Manhattan? And finally, of course, Putnam herself, whose archive has a gaping hole where Gilpin's letters should be, and about whom I've speculated endlessly. How did Brenda feel as her hands shaped wet clay into Laura's form? What was she thinking as rough chisel marks transformed into smooth marble flesh? What were they saying to each other as Laura posed nude and Brenda's eyes lingered over flesh that her hands recreated? Although her letters to Gilpin reveal a variety of intimate relationships with women and one man, Putnam remained single her whole life, a position that has its own queerness. Like most women sculptors of this period, she has been ignored by art historians, although she was celebrated in her lifetime. Putnam met Gilpin through their mutual friend, the writer and musician Anne Simon, whose untimely death in 1916 left both young women heartbroken. At the end of that year, Gilpin moved to New York, where she shared an apartment with Putnam. Her aim was to study photography at the Clarence H. White School, but Gilpin also took lessons from Putnam in sculpture because she felt that the study of three-dimensional modeling would help her understand the way light interacted with the objects in front of her camera. The two women shared a deep love for their lost friend, but their temperaments were often at odds, even as their affection for one another quickly deepened. I feel for both of them when Putnam pleads during one of her occasional bouts of depression, "My dear, you really mustn't. When I tell you there's nothing the matter, I mean it. I'm not trying to put you off. You know you share my griefs and joys. Treat me like a playmate, get mad at me sometimes, scold me, make fun of me, but don't love me too much, because it'll just make me miserabler than ever when I can't respond." 2 days before the first anniversary of Simon's death, Putnam again protested Gilpin's emotional expectations. "If only I could write such a letter as you ask me to," she responded. "But the wretched way with me is the more I feel, the more inexpressive I become." Just 2 months earlier, however, Putnam had expressed her feelings for Gilpin quite clearly. "Oh, why are you so good to me?" she wrote on the 13th of June. "You just mustn't spoil me like this. It's really bad for me, and I want you to save yourself for what may come in the future, not expend all the force of your love now." They remained best friends for 6 decades, and I imagine that in these early days they were more. Certainly their letters were filled with expressions of love, and there's more than a note of jealousy in Putnam's reactions as she watches Gilpin and Foster's love affair develop. Putnam moved to Florence in the 1920s to study sculpture. She shared a studio with Ava Allen, and when Allen and her girlfriend Beryl Birch left Florence, Putnam was lonely. She began an intimate personal investigation of the female form, writing to Gilpin that she had resolved to do a lot of very intimate drawings of myself, nude torso mostly, in my big mirror every evening. "The other day I did a Cubist self-portrait, all straight lines or circles done with a compass, that was really not half bad. Queer, certainly, but I'm sure more like me than any literal portrait I could have achieved." By the spring, she was dying to get back to figures, nice big figures. In Gilpin's reply, the photographer apparently offered her own body as a potential model for such a figure, possibly tongue-in-cheek as she was self-conscious and often expressed a desire to lose weight. Putnam's reply has the quality of taking up a dare. "Yes, my dear, your mile back is just what I want, and I'd do it the moment we get together again." In 1927, the sculptor returned to New York to study with Alexander Archipenko. By August of 1928, she was writing to Gilpin from his studio, describing the gorgeous good fun she was having, making a sort of caricature of a fat female with huge breasts and tummy and spindly legs and a tiny nut of a head. I feel more a sculptor every day. At the end of the month, she reported happily that Archipenko had given her big and buxom Italian girl strong praise. 2 photographs by Gilpin document the final bronze titled Summer. It stands in contrapposto, with shoulder blades pulled back and back arched, emphasizing breasts, belly, and buttocks. The figure's head is abstracted in a mode more closely related to Allen's modernist style than that of Archipenko, and I give you these comparisons as examples. The rest of the figure retains a lifelike quality, offering evidence of Putnam's expertise in anatomy. Translated into a photographic image, the smoothness of the bronze surface is akin to that of skin, and both the lifelikeness and the unlikeliness of this body as a sculptural object make our gaze feel transgressive. Borrowing Putnam's words, the sculpture suddenly feels very intimate. Mary Bergstein and others have written about the documentary photography of sculpture, but little attention has been paid to documentary photography of sculptors. In 1921, Gilpin shot 2 portraits of Putnam. Sorry, this is just a slide to show you the other photograph of Summer. She shot 2 portraits of Putnam, sculpting a portrait bust of the photographer herself. They're extant only as negatives, and they were unpublished, unlike other portraits she made of the sculptor, and their purpose is unclear. Before I turn to those portraits, however, I want to put a slightly later image in view. A 1929 photograph that Gilpin made of her cousin, Lucy Miller Taylor, holding a small plaster portrait bust by Putnam of the photographer. Taylor appears significantly older than Gilpin, and she cradles the sculpted bust almost as though it were a child, with one hand supporting its neck and head and the other balancing it in her lap. Gilpin's plaster profile faces away from the window, an orientation that casts her face into a shadow that flattens and obscures her features. In contrast, Taylor's face is richly modeled, and her torso casts its shadow on the curtain behind her as if to underscore her corporeality. Although her gaze is directed at the plaster, it doesn't look back, suggesting that the pleasure Taylor expresses is a reaction to Putnam's craftsmanship and affection for the photographer it represents. Despite the incidental self-portraiture of the plaster bust, it is a thoroughly conventional image, typical of innumerable portraits created by Gilpin in the 1920s. Gilpin's 1921 portraits of Putnam with her clay bust of Gilpin, on the other hand, are not at all typical. In these images, the sculptor is actually in the process of making. In the image at left, her left hand holds a lump of wet clay, and a tool lies at the base of the unfinished sculpture, waiting to be used. We can imagine the photographer, moments ago the model, thankfully returning to her preferred role as creator. Transforming herself from observed to observer, her act of photography is intentionally analogous to Putnam's act of sculpting. Taylor's portrait is useful here because it prompts a series of comparative observations. Unlike the plaster bust in Gilpin's portrait of Taylor, this clay portrait is life-size. Instead of being subordinated to its human counterpart as the plaster is in Taylor's lap, the clay Gilpin is higher than Putnam, and its gaze sweeps out in a lucidly appraising manner. I suggested a maternal connotation for Taylor's cradling hand. Putnam's touch has an entirely different character. Unlike Taylor, but like the face she sculpts, Putnam is seen in profile. She and her sculpture have equal visual status. Putnam's mimetic realism contributes to this equation, as does Gilpin's monochromatic medium, which renders clay and flesh in strikingly similar tones. The photographer made several formal decisions that further contribute to the impression that we're looking at 2 sentient figures. Her even lighting renders both profiles in appropriately sculptural detail, and her narrow depth of field keeps Putnam and clay Gilpin in sharp focus, while the background is blurred away. Active rather than passive, Putnam's gaze directs us to her manipulation of Gilpin's sculpted flesh, as foreshadowed by the clay in her left hand. Unlike the 1929 plaster, this portrait is more properly a bust, in that it extends down to the middle of Gilpin's chest, and the erotic overtones of this extension are amplified by Putnam's gaze, which is directed to the clay décolletage. Similarly, the sculptor's right hand is curled firmly around Gilpin's nude shoulder. If Taylor's hand evokes the protective gesture used by adults who hold infants, Putnam's gesture recalls the intimacy of ballroom dancing or the physical prelude to a kiss. In the second photograph, Putnam's touch is a caress rather than embrace, but the mood is similarly intimate. Go back to that comparison. From this angle, moreover, Gilpin's slightly parted lips suggest a sudden intake of breath. Without too much imagination, we can feel the electricity between them. Indeed, the tactile relationship created by Putnam and Gilpin in these portraits is part of a formal visual language for lesbian affection that emerged in their work throughout the 1920s. In the spring of 1929, Gilpin visited Putnam in New York, posing for the monumental nude sculpture Midsummer. Gilpin photographed the resulting maquette from several different points of view. The figure is classically posed as a reclining nude, left hand resting on hip with elbow akimbo and eyes almost closed. As she did with Summer, Putnam has modeled Gilpin's flesh in a way that invites not only our gaze, but our awareness of her touch, thanks to the roughly modeled clay. The figure seems lost in her own world, and the drapery covering her feet suggests she has just awoken. Gilpin loved sleep, and the implied intimacy of this pose is surely intentional. In contrast to her dreamy, sculpted self, as Gilpin studied Putnam's sculpture through the ground glass of her large format camera, she extended and returned the sculptor's gaze. In her second photograph, the left arm is revealed, including a hand that was barely visible from the front. Fingers sink into flesh as the figure crooks her elbow. Instead of imagining Putnam touching clay, we're confronted by Gilpin's hand on her own body. My phenomenological response is intense and specific. I know what her hip bone feels like beneath her hand, and I can feel my own skin rolling over my index finger. Without seeing it, I know that the sculpted figure's thumb is also making concave space in her back. The sculpture is extraordinarily literal, and unlike the fragmented form of Summer, enchantingly intimate. 3 years later, Putnam made a full-sized version in clay in preparation for casting a plaster to be exhibited in her retrospective at the Grand Central Galleries in New York. "I'm working away quite feverishly on you," she wrote to Gilpin in May, introducing a slippage between the photographer and the sculpted portrait that would continue to entertain both women whenever they spoke of it. The labor was less erotic than exhausting, although Putnam still invites a phenomenological response from her friend. "My hands are getting quite rheumatic," she complained, "working in wet clay all day." Putnam had been thinking about how best to display the piece for months. "As I intend to place her," she explained to Gilpin in a letter accompanying photographs of the new clay form, "she'll be quite low, so the eye travels all over her and doesn't get such an impression of front, sides, and back. How does she strike you?" The slippage between the two artists in Gilpin's portraits of Putnam is echoed, albeit queerly, by the slippage between Gilpin's body and her sculpted double in Putnam's sculpture. Intriguingly, the critical reception of Midsummer is marked by anxiety about excess. Royal Courtesans wrote, "The nude woman of Summer denotes the fecundity and amplitude of primeval nature, and the very redundancy of Midsummer, with its almost unpleasant fullness and languor, is indicative of a faculty for giving plastic form to a thought." We might be tempted to suggest that the excess he identifies in this sculpture is to be found in its elaboration. The allegory of fruitfulness, introduced by the literal fruit around her, works in opposition to what Courtesans calls the significant simplification of the figure itself. At the same time, its unpleasant fullness and languor irresistibly calls his attention to the sculpture's affect rather than its form. This anxiety is a response to the queerness of Putnam's sculpture. She turns the long tradition of allegorical sculpture on its head by refusing the antiseptic idealism of Renaissance classicism in favor of a body for which she feels desire. In her photograph of Midsummer's maquette, Gilpin doubles that queer gaze, underscoring and memorializing its homoeroticism, while also layering it with an autoerotic quality that augments and echoes the displaced pleasure I imagine Putnam took in manipulating the clay flesh of Gilpin's sculpted body. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, for this very compelling study of the chiasmatic involvement of Gilpin with Putnam. In fact, fulfilling itself and culminating in an abundance of flesh and fruit. Thank you. Our second speaker is Helen A. Fielding, Professor of Philosophy and Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at the University of Western Ontario, Canada. Helen is the author of Cultivating Perception Through Artworks, phenomenological enactments of ethics, politics, and culture, forthcoming in November 21. And co-editor with Dorothea E. Olkowski of Feminist Phenomenology Futures, and with Christina Schuss and Dorothea Olkowski of Time in Feminist Phenomenology. The title of Helen's paper is Joan Mitchell, Cultivating Our Perceptual Nature.
Thank you for that introduction. So I am a philosopher and not an art historian, and I think alongside artworks. This paper comes out of my forthcoming book. Joan Mitchell's abstract expressionist paintings take my breath away, and they have done so for years. I have sought out and visited several major exhibitions on her work, and I turn to her extraordinary works of color to explore how they enact ethics and reveal encountering alterity without appropriation, domination, or fusion. Her paintings of nature resist the imposition of concepts. They reveal the way nature opens up to her and to the viewers of her paintings with its influxes, interflows, cross-currents, mixtures, and interpenetrations, even as it withdraws and remains unknowable. Her works acknowledge the alterity of nature and how it alters her. Working with color, they give us the rhythms of the flesh before or on the other side of the cognitive linguistic that can nonetheless be reflected upon. Her paintings cultivate the perception of nature before the imposition of forms. Abstract Expressionism, a movement that began in New York in the 1940s and 1950s, was about the expression of feelings and inner impulses. But that does not describe Mitchell's works. They are not about the expression of an internal world so much as the expression of her embodied memories of her encounters with places, trees, flowers, water, and landscapes that affected her. And she did not attempt to render them either as likenesses or as sensations. Her works are situated at the threshold between interiority and exteriority, between her own living identity and the world she encounters that shapes her. They open up an approach to nature that takes us beyond things, drawing on a rich perceptual world inflected by feeling, intuition, emotion, touch, movement, and other invisible metabolisms inherent to embodied perception. I'm going to start here. Okay. Un Jardin pour Audrey is a large diptych oil on canvas that solicits my gaze with its riot of oranges, greens, yellows, and pinks. I begin the encounter by allowing my attention to settle into the first panel because it draws my gaze more insistently. Settling in requires vision's interrogating movement. Perceiving eyes are in constant motion. Just as the glance is always on the move, the attentive gaze also does not sit still. The painting's colors pose to my body a kind of questioning, an existential rhythm that attracts or repels. As a sensible work on the verge of being sensed, it poses the question of how to look at it as a sort of confused problem. My body must adjust itself, gear into the work, and find the attitude that will allow it to come into being for me as the response to a poorly formulated question, as Merleau-Ponty puts it. Because there is no object as such for my eyes to grasp, I am more aware of the movement of my gaze across the canvas as it searches for a place to rest. The reds and oranges are luminous, as are the patches of turquoise and emerald green. The movement of my looking is matched by the movement in this panel. If I focus my gaze on the oranges, they seem to cascade down on the left side of the canvas. If I turn to the purples, they jump to the foreground while the other colors almost recede. There is a rhythm to this piece that begins to take shape, emerging only after some time. It is evocative of the sun in the way it lights what is beneath it according to the passage of fast-moving clouds. It is a rhythm created through the relation of the movement of my gaze to the work. Whereas the first panel is lush and vibrating with movement, the second panel is quieter and more meditative. although the luminous orangey red glitters across the darker canvas like sunlight on a stream. A dark pool begins to emerge near the center in shades of emerald green. The movement of relationality emerges as a central theme in Audrey. As I dwell with one panel, it suddenly shifts from seeming flat and resistant to my gaze to opening up and inviting me in. The longer I spend with it, the more there is to see. Details that have previously gone unnoticed suddenly spring to view. In the first panel, I observe the clearing in the top left corner, along with the way the oranges seem to spill past it on their way down the canvas. The second panel now seems dark and flat, but if I shift my gaze to it and give it time, it too suddenly opens up to depth, becoming lighter. And what now is evidently a garden invites me in. Orange is reflected in the pool. This radiant color seems to carry the essences of both flowers and sunlight, which reverberate with the carnal essences I carry within me. But as my gaze settles into the second panel, the first one goes flat and again resists my gaze. Just as two hands that belong to one body can touch and feel different things at the same time, so too can artworks have incomposibles, more meanings than one that do not fit logically together in the way cognition demands. But in my encounter with this painting, the incomposibles reach beyond the body of the work to intertwine with my own embodied perceptual cognition. To experience the two panels in depth at the same time, my eyes must run back and forth across them, creating a chiasmic intertwining with a two that allows each one to bend into and reflect the lines of the other, holding them both open at the same time without one being subsumed into the other. According to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, every painting or spectacle has a total logic belonging to the structure that presents a world. It is the experience of a certain coherence between colors, spatial forms, and the sense of the object. Isolating a color destroys the system of the visual field, which is organized around a dominant color and the precise contrasts to the lighting. No longer are there any determinate things with their own colors. In order to take in both panels at the same time, there is a right place to stand before the work. Nonetheless, Audrey encourages me to walk within the garden, as well alongside the two panels. When I stand close to the canvas to look at the details, I am surprised to see the thickly dabbed gobs of paint, the drips, the singularity of the colors before they intertwine with others in the painting as a whole, modulating individual tufts of color. The colors do not represent, so they cannot lose their representative value when I stand close to the work. But this does not mean they are mere patches of color. These extraordinary brushstrokes of animated color still modulate one another. In whatever way the research is parsed, scientists working from varying theoretical assumptions seem to generally agree that phenomenal experience is merely subjective. In particular, they have struggled with the question of how humans perceive the constancy of colors. For Merleau-Ponty, however, explaining color constancy is not a problem. Color remains constant when it belongs to a field. This means it adheres neither solely to the viewer nor to that which is viewed. He cites an experiment where viewers look into the interior of two boxes, one painted white and dimly illuminated, the other painted black and brightly illuminated. Both boxes appear gray until a black piece of paper is introduced into the white box and a white piece into the black box. The first box now appears white and faintly illuminated, and the second black and brightly illuminated. They now belong to a field. A thing does not become real for vision or for touch, but rather presents an absolute reality when it is given, for Merleau-Ponty, in its maximum articulation, a visual field the body grasps in richness and clarity, where all the senses confirm one another to provide a world. It is, quote, the matter itself that takes on sense and form, unquote. There's a logic then to this world that bodies understand, and to have a sensing body is to be geared into this logic. When empiricists seeking an objective explanation for color look at a white wall in shadow or a gray piece of paper under light, they conclude that the colors of the wall and the paper remain constant as white and gray because these are the colors they remember from normal lighting conditions. They artificially reconstruct the phenomenon. Merleau-Ponty simply sees the piece of paper more clearly. His gaze has a better grasp on it because it is more luminous, more clear. At the same time, the wall that is not lit recedes from his visual grasp. In living perception, color provides an initial approach to the thing, which cannot be recreated in the experimental situation of the laboratory, which isolates one ideal way that color appears and ignores all the others. Colors belong to the things, to a world, and to an existential milieu with which the perceiving subject is synchronized. Merleau-Ponty favored Cézanne because the painter went straight to the world of things themselves in which we are anchored. He made visible how the world touches us, how the things appear and organize themselves before our eyes in a primordial world. This organization of the world relies upon all our senses working together and confirming one another. When Merleau-Ponty gazes at the brilliant green of Cézanne's vase, it does not cause him to think of pottery. It presents it to him. It is there along with its thin and smooth outer surface and its porous interior in the particular manner in which the green is modulated. And that's a quote from Merleau-Ponty. If a phenomenon presents itself to only one of his senses, it might seem almost a phantom. But in the painting, it is not just the green he sees, but also the way it feels, the smoothness and the texture of the vase and its fragility. The vase is not a phantom. It approaches real existence. Because the painting opens onto a world, all the senses confirm one another. A painting includes, as he says, even the odor of the landscape. But I cannot gaze at Un Jardin pour Audrey as one would an object in the world as such. My gaze is generally more at home in a figurative painting, since it is already familiar with the things it gears into to encounter the work. It revives previously sedimented ways of perceiving. Mitchell's paintings do not so easily offer this comfort. I encounter the painting by responding to the solicitation of the vibrant colors to look at it. Yet being open to the work is, in itself, not sufficient. I must dwell with the work, specifying, articulating, and sedimenting new perceptual structures. Colors are not given as sensations, but rather as sensibles. To see the work is to see according to it, to enter into its world, and this I can do because I am sensitive to colors. Merleau-Ponty is right. The perception is anonymous and pre-personal, that I cannot make my body respond to the work. I give over to the painting. I do not try to think it, just as I do not think the blue of the sky or stand over and against it as I might an object. Rather, the blue of the sky thinks itself in me. That's Merleau. My body responds to the blue, which in turn invites my body to gear into its depth. This sensitivity is a corporeal capacity that precedes me as a subject, that opens my body onto a world through a kind of primordial contract, without me even trying. Because perception is this pact with the world, it belongs to a horizon and a visual field. Although my body is sensitive to colors, the visual field in Audrey is not immediately familiar to me. The painting offers up an abundance of intertwinings, of tufts and thickets that belong to flesh. As I stay with the painting, my phenomenal perception is drawn into relation with it, setting to work in me, without me. I run my eyes over its surface, encountering it rather than projecting onto it ideas and concepts that would only shut the work down rather than open it up. According to the accompanying information that tells viewers how to understand the painting, Audrey portrays a heavenly garden. When possible, as in this case, I only read about the work at the end of my first encounter, since I do not want the art historian's categories to shape the experience for me. This concept of heavenly gardens united as one does not sit well with me. I've noticed, for example, how in both panels there are drips of paint moving from top to bottom that seem to become more insistent over time. They draw my vision into the ground, even as the colors lifted up. I feel the downward motion. The dark strokes at the top of both panels also push the eye downward. If this is a heavenly garden, why does the pull of gravity draw the viewer so decidedly back to earth? The materiality of the work suggests to me that we cannot leave the world behind. Heaven is on earth, in our intertwinements with one another, with nature, and with the world. The painting was apparently dedicated to Mitchell's friend Audrey Hess, who had recently died. To love someone is to recognize their complexity, the incompossibles or contradictions, and to accept the bleaker moments along with the joyous ones. The essence of Audrey continues to live in the flesh of her friend, the painter, and the flesh of the painting, which is in turn opened up to me to reflect upon through my encounter. For Merleau-Ponty, modern artists aim at, quote, multiplying the systems of equivalences towards severing their adherence to the envelope of things, unquote. Nonetheless, these systems of equivalences are a further indication that there is a logos of lines that our bodies understand. Bodies respond to these lines, which can be transposed into any medium. Artworks speak to an embodied logos that understands the logic of lighting, color, and movement. Ultimately, it is not a matter of choosing between figurative and non-figurative painting, since abstract painting, along with Caravaggio's grape, belong to this same circuit of being that shows itself, reverberates, and modulates in things and their appearances. Mitchell's paintings enact ethics by cultivating embodied phenomenal perception to be open to alterity, to that which alters us. As an artist, she reveals alterity not through appropriating it into her own work without acknowledgement, but rather by showing how it deepens her own identity and sense of self. Her works allow for other metabolisms and relations than our relations to things. They reveal how reality is relational and expands our understanding of what it means to be in touch with being. Her works reveal how she bends into the lines of nature and how nature opens her up to new and generative forms of expression. It is not just a way of seeing, it is a relational practice. And this is the meaning of nature in its Greek sense of phusis, as generativity. Thank you.
Thank you for such a sensitive response to the riotous Jardin pour Audrey. I was drawn into its nooks, recesses, and rhythms. Our last speaker is Stefan Terolba, a PhD candidate in English with a designated emphasis in Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Riverside. They are currently working on their dissertation on queer and trans Filipina, Filipinx, American and US Latino, Latina, Latinx, artistic and literary practices. They are also co-editing a special issue of the Black aesthetics journal, Liquid Blackness, published through Duke University Press. The title of Steph's paper is Dirty Looks, Kelvin Boson's and Zandra Ibarra's relational performances of the Rorschach.
Thank you, Elizabeth, as well as the Croteau Institute of Art, for inviting me to be part of this lovely two-day event. As several scholars of visual culture and race have described, the visual has historically been a location of epistemic and ontological violence for minoritized subjects, given its structural function within colonial hierarchies of racial, gendered, and sexual difference. The violence embedded in Western visual economies is exemplified in the frequent use of the camera in the subjugation of racialized groups since the technology's inception in the mid-19th century. Indeed, as a visual technology, the camera has played a prominent and crucial role in the consolidation of the project of colonial modernity, given that the visual field has historically been a site of epistemic and ontological racial violence, and that visual technologies have traditionally been tools of colonial and imperial subjugation, this talk investigates how minoritized subjects mobilize technologies of seeing, technologies which have historically been tools of racial subjugation, to imagine race and relationality differently. This talk explores possibilities for minoritized culture producers to mobilize visual technologies in order to construct anti-hegemonic relationalities that refuse white supremacist visual logics. Queer artists of color and their visual reenactments of the Rorschach test, popularized in the 20th century by the Swiss psychiatrist Rorschach and colloquially known as the inkblot test, are a particular case in point. In what follows, I analyze the 2013 multimedia project She's on the Rag by queer Chicana performance artist and multidisciplinary artist Sandra Ibarra, alongside the 2015 performance video Rorschach Dream Sequence by gay Filipino-American visual artist Kelvin Berzon. The artist's embodiment constitutes the main spectacle of each project, as Ibarra and Berzon employ their own bodies as their artistic medium. In She's on the Rag, Ibarra uses her menstrual blood to paint inkblot prints. In Rorschach Dream Sequence, Berzon darkens his nude body with paint in order to smear a white background. He then deploys digital editing techniques in order to visualize multiplicities of his body to create inkblot forms. I propose that Ibarra's and Berzon's performances of the Rorschach test point toward different pathways for constructing more ethical relationalities between self and others. Ultimately, I argue that in She's on the Rag and Rorschach Dream Sequence, the artists employ their own body as aesthetic materials to critique the racializing processes that structure hegemonic white supremacist visual regimes. Simultaneously, through how they use their bodies within their practices, these artists also critique visual technologies like photography and video that have historically attempted to render queer racial subjects as knowable objects through a white male colonial gaze. I further argue that through this dual schema, Ibarra and Berzon disrupt hegemonic visual economies in order to unsettle the relational logics between viewing subject and viewed object that demand knowability. By enacting this rupture, these artists, as my analyses reveal, imagine more ethical, reparative modalities of relationality that are premised on difference and illegibility. So, part 1, Unclean Bodies, Unsightliness in She's on the Rag. She's on the Rag is a multimedia piece that consists of visual installations of inkblot designs Ibarra created using her own menstrual blood. So here, for example, is one of her inkblot prints. The artist sells each menstrual inkblot on a now defunct Etsy shop for $50 to $100 USD. I read Ibarra's use of menstrual blood in her project as a strategy for critiquing the colonial and imperial machinations of Latina racialization and sexualization. The menstrual blood draws attention to stereotypes that racialize Latina femininity as dirty, untidy, and excessive. These racial stereotypes, now deeply embedded in the US cultural imaginary, are exemplified in Americanization Through Homemaking, a 1929 teacher manual designed to help assimilate elementary school-age Mexican girls into American life. In the manual, Mexican women are racialized as unsanitary and unhygienic. Quote, "Teach Mexican girls the importance of durable and clean underwear. They are apt to be lax in this respect. Impress it upon the girl's mind that a clean body and a clean mind are the attributes of a good citizen." End quote. It's terrible. In light of the racializing stereotypes that link Latina femininity to embodied excess and undisciplined messiness, Ibarra's She's on the Rag reveals how Latina femininity is perpetually excluded from normative femininity premised on whiteness, and further the category of the quote-unquote good citizen, premised on sexual reproduction and cleanliness. The usage of menstrual blood in She's on the Rag draws attention to the ways that cis heterosexist white supremacy, specifically in a US context, figures Latina femininity as undesirable and disorderly. Simultaneously, however, in how her work cheekily inhabits these racializing metaphors, Ibarra also resignifies these racial tropes in order to create a site of resistance against white supremacist relational structures that attempts to render racial other knowable via these very racializing metaphors. The use of discarded parts of her body, namely, in this case, uterine lining, allows Ibarra to present herself opaquely. She is able to show her body without directly showing her body. Through this opaque spectacle, Ibarra not only draws attention to the Western racial logics that figure her flesh as repulsive, dirty, and loathsome, she also imagines alternative modes of apprehending and constructing relationalities between bodies. This schema is particularly evident in the product description seen on the Etsy shop Ibarra uses to sell her menstrual ink blots. And this site was active from 2015 to 2020. When purchasing a menstrual ink blot, potential buyers can select the ink blot's flavor. Flavors include Red Bull, Earthy Chianti, and Chipotle Chile, and you can see the flavors in this figure. In one sense, the ability to decide the flavor of the ink blot cheekily connects together multiple modes of consumption: capitalist consumption, voyeuristic consumption, and dietary consumption. However, the flavor selection also points to an alternative subject-object relationality. Rather than being based in scopophilic and objectifying visual economies, this relationality is based in sensuousness, pleasure, and embodiment. Tasting the menstrual ink blot invitingly suggests alternative modes of apprehending the work and further Ibarra's body through sensorial means that exceed the visual. By pointing toward different modes of apprehending her body through other senses, in this case taste, Ibarra humorously speculates on other possibilities of forming relations between self and other. Through this speculative process, she gestures toward more ethical ways of building relationalities between bodies and further apprehending racial difference. These alternative relational modes bypass the alienating and othering power dynamics operationalized through the visual. In order to move beyond conventional racial logics grounded in visuality, the artist imagines a relationality founded on sensation and pleasure. By offering a different mode of understanding race that is premised on the materiality of her own flesh, Ibarra offers a pathway for defining racial subjectivity beyond the tropes of a white supremacist gaze. And this brings me to part 2, Dreams of Difference, the Opaque Performances of Rorschach Dream Sequence. So I now turn to another queer racialized culture producer, the gay Filipino-American visual artist Kelvin Brazon. I examine how he confronts the historical processes that condition racial subjectivities through his artistic practice in a manner similar to Ibarra. I focus here on his performance video from 2015, Rorschach Dream Sequence, which has received relatively little attention from critics and journalists compared to his other works. So I am going to turn over to Vimeo and I'll play about 20 seconds of his performance video piece. For the sake of time, that is unfortunately all that I can play for now. Created while the artist was completing his MFA in photography at Indiana University, Rorschach Dream Sequence is part of a larger project titled Rorschach that mainly consists of digital portrait photographs. The video depicts Brazon nude and covered in dark body paint, lying against a stark white background with a camera overhead. Over the duration of the 5-minute performance, the artist moves around and contorts himself, imitating a person in slumber. According to the video's description and the artist's blog, these choreographed movements are based on a time-lapse video of the artist sleeping. The artist also uses digital editing techniques to replicate his body 4 times, mirroring it across an XY axis. The mirroring effects make the smear traces of the white background visually resemble the symmetrical inkblot patterns of the Rorschach test. I contend that the materials Brazon uses in his project open possibilities for reckoning with the historical processes that continually structure Filipino subjecthood within an imperial US imaginary. The dark paint that crudely covers the artist's skin and that smears the white background behind him gives the artist's body a dirty appearance and quality. This imagery of uncontainable dirt and filth alludes to the tropes of uncleanliness and savagery that have historically structured and continue to structure white imperial fantasies of Filipinos, the Philippines, and the global South more broadly. The dark paint that marks Brazon's body throughout the video thus addresses the racializing tropes that structure Filipino subjectivities within global and imperial imaginaries. However, in how his work inhabits these very racializing tropes, Brazon, in a manner akin to Ibarra, uses his art practice to speculate on alternative modes of apprehending racial difference, and further imagining relationalities between subjects. Although Brazon employs his body as a visual signifier of racial and sexual otherness, the choreographed movements of his body displayed throughout the video create an opaque performance. Inspired by the recorded movements of the artist in slumber, Brezon's choreography draws attention to the ways that embodied experiences of queer racialized subjects act as locations for minoritarian modes of knowledge production and meaning-making. The spectacularization of the artist's choreographed body via digital mirroring effects not only evokes the visual imagery of the Rorschach test, it also serves as an invitation for the viewer to gaze upon his body via a highly mediated performance. This invitation to gaze upon the artist's body allows Brezon to subvert the power dynamics of traditional visual economies and further subject-object relations. Through this mediated and choreographed spectacle, the artist controls how the viewer is able to witness his body. By spectacularly inviting the viewer's gaze and controlling how the viewer sees him, Brezon's performance reveals the inefficacy of 20th-century psychiatric technologies like the Rorschach test to apprehend his interiority. The title of the piece makes this point especially evident. Rorschach dream sequence suggests that the performance will somehow permit the viewer to access Brezon's interior life via his dreams. But as the performance unfolds, the viewer is only able to access what Brezon wants the viewer to access, namely a carefully choreographed performance of the artist in slumber. Although the viewer cannot access Brezon's interiority, we cannot know what Brezon is dreaming about. The choreographed movements that mimic slumber, coupled with the piece's title, dream sequence, usefully point toward the utopic potentials of Brezon's project. Dreaming is an anticipatory act that exceeds documentation and archiving. As such, it gestures toward other possibilities of being in and experiencing the world, particularly for queer racial subjects. While this radical act can be visualized via technologies like photography, it also cannot be fully captured via colonial visual apparati as it exceeds the frame. Brezon's staged performance of dreaming makes these machinations apparent. His performance points to the speculative and utopic work that queer of color subjects perform every day, and localizes this radical reparative work within the embodied experiences of queer racial bodies. Rorschach dream sequence points to reparative possibilities for relationalities that, rather than demanding knowability, are instead premised on difference and opacity. So turning back to the PowerPoints. My readings of Sandra Ibarra's She's on the Rag and Kelvin Brezon's Rorschach dream sequence reveal how the artists employ their bodies in their projects to unsettle the relational logics that demand knowability in order to work toward reparative modes of relationality. Such reparative relationalities point toward novel pathways for transformative and collective healing that allow queers of color to confront and work through the trauma, melancholia, and debasement of queer racial life under regimes of cis-heterosexist white supremacy. Through my engagements with these cultural productions, my analyses identify the flesh of queer of color subjects as materials imbued with utopic world-making potential. I contend that artistic practices by queer racial aesthetic workers that center their embodiments may reveal productive sites for both critiquing the logics of domination and envisioning more ethical ways of being in and experiencing the world with others. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking paper on the ethics of reparation against the threat of recuperation. In fact, I should like to thank our three speakers for their empathetic investigations into the ethical stakes of the phenomenon of viewing as a truly transportative and transformative experience through various registers of visibility, touchability, and sensoriality, for capturing so vividly the rapture of their artistic encounters, prompting us to tune into the world in its multifarious otherness and to imagine ethical alternatives, hence the value of such prefixes as inter and trans. So as I said, I shall be taking questions from the chat box. I might kick off if it's all right. I had a question, in fact, for all our panelists about the experience of illness, grief, and trauma, and its relevance to the artistic practices of the artists that you've studied. So I don't know who wants to answer that first.
I'm going to suggest Louise or Stefan take that on because I think that it's more appropriate, really.
Sorry, I was getting myself organized to turn my camera on and things while you asked the question. It was about trauma and how that impacts.
Yes, it was about grief, trauma, illness. So illness, I was thinking about Joan Mitchell, but they've all experienced some form of grief or illness or trauma. And I was wondering about how they incorporate that into their practice, or whether it's relevant, in fact, might not be.
For Putnam, I think it's a really important question because she sort of lived with the grief. I don't think she was single by choice necessarily. And so this practice of kind of sculpting and resculpting Gilpin and really other people in her life, to me, is this way of bringing them back into her presence kind of insistently, even though they're absent. And I hesitate to say more than that at this point, but I do think it's a really important question. And an important one for Gilpin too, who suffered all kinds of losses. Foster had polioencephalitis and couldn't speak or move really for several years. And they lived through that together. So it has impacts long beyond the 1920s in her life. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just say, because I work with a phenomenological methodology, I try to stay away from the psychological influences or the psychoanalytic influences on the artists I work with, although there's huge, wonderful bodies of work done in that way. I work with what is the work and what is communicated through that work. And one can, I think, be in contact with some of that pain through the flesh of the painting. It's there, but for me, I would access it through the work rather than through knowing about and exploring her illness as something apart from the work.
Thank you.
I guess I'll say that the questions of trauma and melancholia are really, they're really important and foundational to my project. In the longer, 30-page version of this paper, and I had to cut it out for the sake of for making a legible conference presentation, but I actually am thinking about abjection and how these artists are employing their artistic practices as a response to the ways that these minoritarian racial subjectivities are conditioned and are structured via their kind of exclusion from the hegemonic body politic, and also how abjection is linked to disgust. So minoritarian subjects are simultaneously excluded from the body politic, but also the processes and machinations that exclude them are also the processes that render them that create these metaphors of race that are premised on repulsiveness and grotesqueness. And in the longer paper, I'm thinking about how abjection induces melancholia and trauma in minoritized subjects. But also I'm thinking here, and I haven't fully developed this through yet, but I'm also interested in thinking about how in inhabiting these locations of abjection, so the project as I discussed, actually features artists who are inhabiting the very grotesque tropes that are premised on abjection. I'm interested in how that allows them to work through the trauma and melancholia that I think conditions queer racial life, but also maybe those locations can also be possible sites for pleasure as well. So maybe these artistic practices, there is a possibility of fun in them within this site that is supposed to induce grief and trauma and debasement. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Actually, we do have a question for you, Steph. It's about Zandra's short film. So somebody is actually wondering if Zandra's short film incorporating her Rorschach will be a part of the larger project from which your presentation is drawn?
The short answer is yes. She's on the Rag is like a very multimedia project that has like a lot of facets to it. There is like a video that in which Sandra Ibarra kind of, for lack of a better word, she like animates the menstrual ink blots, and she offers a reading. So one thing that I did not get into in this presentation, just for the sake of time, is that again, she sells the menstrual ink blots on her Etsy shop, on a now defunct Etsy shop that was it was operational from 2015 to 2020. But with the sales, she also has a prompt that where she asks consumers or people who receive these menstrual ink blots to give her a call and tell them what they see in the image. So it is meant to be like an actual, it's meant to perform the psychiatric function of Rorschach test. It's meant to like be an interpretive practice. And then from there, she is, if I recall correctly, she is supposed to schedule like a meeting in which they have essentially something akin to like a psychotherapy session. And in the video that supplements the series, she offers something akin to that. So she like performs a reading of the viewer who is watching her video at this moment, and it's this really interesting kind of like reversal where the object that like the object is doing the reading of like the viewing subject. But yes, all this to say, the video is really interesting, and it's available on her Vimeo and her website, so please check it out. But yes, in short, I am interested in thinking about the video that supplements the series.
Can I just jump in here? One of the connections I see between I found between our work here and Carol's question is, you're also getting at that resistance. How can we get at this interiority, this psychic life through the work itself? And I guess that's what I'm also trying to say is, why are we, we're looking for this psychic, this interiority, but here's the work, and the work is resistant. It's giving us something else in the interiority of course the interiority is in some way there, but not in this transparent, here is what I'm thinking or what's going on inside of me. The artist brings everything, all of their experiences and that trauma to the work, but to think that work will now expose them. So anyways,
it seems to me that Ibarra's work is proposing exactly the opposite, right? Like she's saying that it's exposing the viewer, and sort of it's about reception fundamentally. I know we're way over time already, I think, but I just wanted to ask Steph also if the work of T. Corinne and Ana Mendieta, which they both make work that seems connected. The body tracks of Mendieta and the yantras of Corinne seem like really important references for Ibarra's work. And they're both doing what they did in the 80s, and it's kind of a much earlier generation, but I wondered if there was a dialogue there.
Well, thank you for both Helen and Louise for your insights and your observations. Ana Mendieta, for my project, has been really helpful in helping me think about opacity. This idea, which gets at like what Helen is talking about, this idea of like presenting the self, but in a way that is not really presenting the self, because of how like I'm especially interested in like how Ana Mendieta in like body tracks, she kind of like evades the viewer's gaze by like looking away or never showing her face, right? And Kelvin Brizan, even though that is a bit of a leap, but Kelvin Brizan does, I think, in his project do a similar thing, which is also present in Ibarra's project too. This idea of like not really showing the self, or showing like an artificialized or incomplete version of the self, and the potential liberatory possibilities of like showing the self, but also not showing a complete self at the same time, like controlling what the viewer is able to see and gaze at.
Okay, thank you so much. I actually have a question for Helen here in the chat box. Somebody is interested in the simultaneity of your viewing experience of Un Jardin pour Audrey and the synchronized experience of the subject with the world in Merleau-Ponty's account. Mitchell often talked about her paintings as striving towards accuracy, saying she was trying to accurately capture her full sense memories or memories of her feelings and experience. Could you talk about the relationship of Merleau-Ponty's synchronizing and Mitchell's concept of accuracy, please?
Yeah. That's a wonderful question. Really has me, I have to think. So I think for what is important to me about Mitchell is, like, unlike some of her contemporaries or those who are perhaps before her, like Pollock, who, okay, it's this interior, I'm just throwing out the paint onto the canvas. She was really trying to, that accuracy is about how does she encountering that which is there, not imposing her own concepts, her own ideas, but how does she acknowledge the alterity of nature, and so that accuracy is really trying to attend to who or what is there. And I think that, just to connect again back to Louise and Stefan's wonderful papers, right, it is to get beyond those projections of, you know, the racialization and heteronormative, all of those, that is a projection, whereas her work is really how can you be accurate about really trying to be in contact with, or to give what is there and who is there, and so the synchronizing is really that attitude of being in tune with, trying to be in tune with what's there.
Yes, and I think it transpired from all your papers, actually, that level of engagement, attentiveness, alertness. It's truly ethical, isn't it? Okay, there is, I think, a question, a last question that we may be able to take, a fairly broad question. A politics of pleasure seems important to each of the speakers' projects. I am wondering if they could elaborate on this, either in relationship to the works they are working on or in their own writing practice, or both.
I'm going to jump right on this. Pleasure is fundamental to this project for me, and sort of came out of this question of, so Gilpin, and I don't know how much people know about her, but she is famous for photographing the Navajo. And she published a book in 1968 called The Enduring Navajo, and it has been pretty much ignored by art historians. And when it hasn't been ignored, it's been condemned as very sort of following in the footsteps of Edward Curtis, and this sort of problematically ethnographic book, which, if you read the book, is not at all what it's doing. But I think people just saw white women photographing Indians must be part of this kind of colonial racist project. And her early work, I wouldn't deny, is absolutely participating in that in some ways, but she politicizes alongside the people she's working with on the Navajo Nation, basically. So I came to her because I was like, I love these photographs. They seem to be doing something different to me. I didn't know anything about the history, but I took pleasure in them. And discovering that she was lesbian made me ask, basically, like, is there a kind of lesbian gaze in this essentializing way? I think that's not true. But is there something that I see in the pleasure that she took in making these images that is worth pursuing? And what would my pleasure be in recuperating her as an artist because of this coincidence of identity? And as I did that work, the pleasure led me to a much more rigorous historical argument. And then in the writing, I've come back, as I was trying to kind of perform, I think, in this paper, this idea of the pleasure of looking and the pleasure of experience. And sort of my reception of her images and her production of them are obviously not coming from the same place, but is there an analogy to be made that's really productive? Yeah, I see Elizabeth saying that we're once again running over. Thank you for letting me talk so long.
No, thank you very much. And actually, you've kind of answered to a certain extent another question, which was for all of you, a brilliant question about your own subjectivity versus that of the artist. But I think we have to wind up now. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you all so much for that brilliant panel. We were so happy to speak that we ran right through the break. So we are going to move now right into our second panel, which is called Reorientations Toward the Landscape. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for that panel, who is Iggy Cortez. Iggy is the Mellon Assistant Professor in Cinema and Media Arts at Vanderbilt University. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Camera Obscura, and CAA Reviews, among other venues. And he is currently at work on a book on nighttime in world cinema. So I will turn it over to you, Iggy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the next few speakers. The first speaker will be Remy Mize. Remy Mize is the Douglas Foundation Fellow and Steinman Research Assistant at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Pennsylvania. Her scholarship and curatorial practice focus on 19th century US, Latin American, and Native American art and visual culture. Her research has appeared in academic journals such as Lapis, Contemporaneity, and Rutgers Art Review, as well as exhibition catalogs by the Colby College Museum of Art and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Her paper today is entitled Metakuye Oyasin, Relations Between Buffalo, People, and Place in Plains Painting.
Thank you so much, Iggy, for that introduction. Thank you so much to Elizabeth for organizing this incredible symposium today. And as you can see, I am outdoors. I hope that's all right. I'm having some Wi-Fi issues at home, so I'm connecting to public libraries Wi-Fi and enjoying the loving embrace of this tree. So hopefully the atmospheric sounds are not too intrusive, but thank you for bearing with me. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I first want to acknowledge that I am sharing this presentation from the ancestral homelands of the Wabanaki, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, and Abenaki peoples. I pay respect to these nations, past, present, and future. I understand and seek to honor the fact that this acknowledgement is simply a prerequisite for reducing settler harm, foregrounding Indigenous sovereignty, and repatriating Indigenous land. Scholars have remarked with striking persistence on a perceived lack of landscape in buffalo hide paintings by Indigenous artists of the North American Great Plains. Art historian Evan M. Maurer, for example, in his visual analysis of this pictographic robe in the collection of the Musée de Quai Branly, describes the some 60 figures that animate the surface as being, quote, set against the blank background of the hide with no indication of landscape elements like mountains or even trees to give a sense of place, end quote. His assumption raises several questions. Are representational landscape elements the only guarantors of place in a material image? How do place-based relations manifest in Plains art? How and for what purpose do different cultures perceive the presence or absence of place? Cold Lake First Nations artist Kimawan Mechuwe thematized these queries in his 2002 installation Without Ground, an almost spectral assembly of photo-transferred human figures who stride, crouch, and linger across an otherwise vacant white wall. In this work, Mechuwe draws critical attention to land by virtue of its conspicuous absence. The congregation of figures form an anchorless search party, combing through a crime scene that encompasses the entirety of Turtle Island or North America. Referring to 19th and early 20th century Plains painting practices, Mechuwe asserts, quote, land in these paintings is not absent, it just remains unseen. He resists the entrenchment of Euro-American formal conventions like linear perspective. Why bother to make an issue about the construction of illusionary space? I am concerned about how people see the landscape of North America. I want to tell them that even if they can't see something, it is still there, like Indian people and our land. Mechuwe calls attention to how the act of deeming an image placeless actually extends the broader agenda of settler colonialism, an agenda that has strategically characterized this continent as empty in order to similarly invisibilize Native American people, to obscure both their spiritual relationships with and legal claims to their homelands. Indeed, this willful inability to see the vital role played by place for Native nations has carried profound utility for US empire, extractive capitalism, and indigenous erasure. Harking back to 19th century US Army surveyors like Zebulon Pike and Stephen H. Long, who disseminated the idea that the Plains region was simply one vast desert. And you see that in this wood engraving, the Great American Desert caption. This attitude continues and was on full display just this past April when CNN pundit and former Republican Senator Rick Santorum made the preposterous claim that the US had been created from, quote, nothing, that it was a, quote, blank slate before the arrival of colonizers. As a white settler scholar committed to an anti-colonial art history, I hope to respond to Metue's appeal to dismantle settler illusions of blank background and blank slate, and to problematize our assumptions as to what landscape is and where it is located in a work of art. To do this, I offer one potential avenue for recentering place and environment in Plains painting by looking beyond a Western model of landscape representation and focusing instead on the material ground of these works, the tanned and textured surface of buffalo hide itself, and the manifold relations it embodies. Amongst Plains cultures, there is a shared understanding that the bison is a sacred being and that this sanctity encompasses all of the animal's respective parts. Art historian Jessica Horton highlights the implication of this notion for the significance of hide in Plains painting, quote, skins were more than a dead ground upon which anthropocentric histories were inscribed. Animals were spiritual intermediaries in the events whose memory they hosted, end quote. A key source of both physical and spiritual sustenance for Plains people by the late 17th century, buffalo helped form the basis for a collective sense of place. Painters rendered vivid scenes of wars, hunts, and other incidents of human history across buffalo hide with buffalo bone brushes, and together the medium, tools, and subject reiterated the animal's centrality. Indeed, the wider significance of buffalo to Plains people cannot be overstated. Emma Hansen, curator and citizen of Pawnee Nation, refers to buffalo as, quote, the center of life. David Posthumus, an anthropologist of Lakota culture, characterizes the buffalo as, quote, the lifeblood of the people and a foundational institution. According to the Lakota worldview, which has similarities to those of neighboring Plains nations like the Cheyenne, Apsáalooke, Mandan, Kiowa, and others, bison were and are described as relatives belonging to a distinct Oyate people, nation, or tribe, and Oyate is Lakota. The Lakota ceremonial maxim, Mitaki Oyas'in, meaning I am related to all things or all my relatives, encapsulates this shared understanding and conveys the fundamental Lakota belief that all life forms, human and non-human, are endowed with personhood and united in kinship networks involving reciprocal obligations, responsibilities, and mutual respect. In the words of Tewa scientist Gregory Kahete, quote, as we experience the world, so we are also experienced by the world, end quote. Beyond their physical form as earthly animals, bison were also understood to channel tatanka, or buffalo bull spirit. Tatanka was capable of imparting such properties as virtue, fertility, and vigor in a Lakota concept, and was symbolically aligned with the sun. As a bestower of vitality and abundance, P'tay Oyate, or Buffalo Nation, afforded Lakotas and other Plains communities with a vast array of goods and resources, including creative works. Bison rendered the Great Plains, an often severe and challenging landscape for human survival, hospitable. According to the late Smithsonian curator and Gross Venture tribal member George P. Horsecapture, skins from many animals were also useful, but it was, quote, buffalo hide that made for the most enduring art object. Hide preparation, a laborious task typically undertaken by Plains women, required a great deal of time, technique, and effort. As illustrated in Kiowa artist Woha's 1877 drawing, Scene of Buffalo Butchering, the animal's body cavities were cleaned and a slit made down the middle of the back from nose to tail. The hide was slowly removed. Sometimes, if large enough, it was divided into two sections. The expansive pelt was then staked out on the ground or affixed to a frame, and this step in the process is captured in this photograph by Stanley J. Morrow. Women then scraped all flesh from the hide using a scraper tool and subsequently commenced the tanning procedure by applying a composite of the animal's own brains to the surface. The enzymes of this admixture chemically altered the hide's texture, which was made even smoother through further stretching and rubbing. And here we see some of the tools that aided these methods, including a hide scraper at upper left, a hide smoother at right, and a buffalo horn paint bag at lower left. Buffalo bones perform the same role as paintbrushes, their porous structures readily absorbing paint from various natural sources, such as red from berries, green from lichen or vegetable matter, and yellow from pulverized buffalo gallstones. To paint a scene, an artist would first limn the contours of the composition with a sharp stick dipped in charcoal, etching deep, clear outlines into the prepared surface. They would then apply pigment to the bone brush and press it into the hide, transferring the paint from bone to flesh. 3 general types of painted hide were common: winter counts, pictographic robes, and robes with geometric designs. And here you see a winter count. And these chronicled the history of an entire community, with each year recorded and encapsulated by a mnemonic symbolic image. These more autobiographical pictorial robes served as visual testimony of individual feats of bravery in warfare or images from personal visions, generally painted by the people who experienced them. And robes with geometric emblems were often painted and worn by women, and typically donned in maturity ceremonies. In both Arapaho and Lakota examples of this third form of painted hide, we see variations of the box and border pattern, an abstract composition suggested by Kiowa scholar Jenny Tompahote and others as perhaps a schematic approximation of the internal organ structure of the buffalo. Here we see a buffalo robe collected by Prince Maximilian of Wied during an expedition to Fort Pierre in 1833. The expedition's painter, Carl Bodmer, registers the same robe in the documentary Watercolor at Left, possibly shown draped across the shoulders of the original artist. It is significant that hide preparers intentionally maintain the skin's natural contours, its geography, so to speak, an organic shape that was further reinforced by the prominent border, stressing the animal's outstretched form. In this way, artists honored the integrity of the material, and the hide, in turn, was understood to actively empower wearers with the vitality of the buffalo through medium and motif. 19th and early 20th century Lakota spiritual leader Black Elk once declared, quote, "The bison is the chief of all the animals and represents the earth, the totality of all that is." Lakotas continue to regard Paha Sapa, or the Black Hills in present-day South Dakota, as the sacred center of their world, in part because it was once among the premier sites of seasonal buffalo congregations. Moreover, the geographical extent traversed by buffalo in their annual migrations constituted Lakota's perception of territory and belonging. In 1865, two lances offered a similar observation. Quote, "God has made all things. He made the ground and all that is on it. He gave me the buffalo. I have lived on the buffalo. I was raised on it and have raised all my children on it. The buffalo I wish above all things." Living on the buffalo, living on the land, these experiences were inextricable for Lakotas and other Plains nations. The buffalo was thus more than a mere symbol of the earth. It was an indelible part of the whole. In this way, I argue that it is possible to perceive the Plains landscape metonymically and materially in the very flesh of hide paintings. This mode of seeing is critically informed by indigenous epistemologies, as well as the methodologies of eco-critical art history, both of which prioritize the principles of interconnectedness and relationality. Thus equipped, we can look beyond the restrictive settler-defined category of landscape, working instead with a more generative and pervasive notion of place, and how a sense of place might manifest as symbol, matter, art. Consider this work painted by Mato Tope, or Forebears, a Mandan chief who lived along the upper Missouri River. In this autobiographical robe, Mato Tope meticulously depicts 8 different battle exploits. These individuals' vignettes circumnavigate both the splayed expanse of the buffalo skin as well as the central circular design. Known as a sunburst or feathered sun, this form symbolically carries the solar potency concentrated in the buffalo. It was the same essential energy that enabled Mato Tope's own military forays, which then supplied the inspiration for the painting. Pattern, representation, and material ground layer and interlock with one another. Their imbricated meanings coalesce to communicate the idea of buffalo as medium, the connective tissue between land and life, people and place. Emma Hansen eloquently articulates this nexus, quote, "From generation to generation, Native people of the plains articulated their senses of place, their conceptions of their landscapes and traditional homelands, and the gifts of the plants and animals living there, through oral and artistic traditions that supported and were intertwined with all aspects of life," end quote. With this relational perception of place in mind, we understand how the buffalo's body might act as a material link or bridge between a painting and the plains environment, with or without explicit landscape imagery. In addition to this notion of hide as both medium and metonymic environment, we can also pinpoint formal affinities between bison and environment in compositions where landscape does, albeit rarely, appear. In this drawing of a group hunt by Cheyenne artist Shavehead, the sloping backs and distinctive humps of the bison visually echo the undulating lines that form the hills through which they run. These animals, whose anatomies once supplied artistic ground for plains painters, were increasingly limited to the pictorial register as the 19th century progressed. This shift was, in many ways, necessitated by historical conditions that precipitated the near extinction of the buffalo. Scientists and environmental historians generally estimate that the North American buffalo population reached as many as 30 million around 1500, maintaining numbers until the increasingly vehement settler colonial incursions in the 19th century. The fact that bison numbers were once so vast makes their sudden, violent decline all the more astonishing. By 1883, their decimation was nearly complete, the result of complex forces stemming from global trade and climate change. It was, however, the profound swell of settler hide hunters from 1867 to 1883 that almost irrevocably accelerated the bison's decline. During this short period, they slaughtered millions of animals. This anthropogenic extinction attempt was met with the tacit approval of the US government. In 1895, fewer than 1,000 buffalo survived. Where they once roamed, miles of bones lay scattered. Even these remains found a market value in the capitalist system, gathered into morbid mountains awaiting conversion into fertilizer or carbon. As John Gast's American Progress of 1872 makes clear, buffalo and indigenous nations alike were targeted by the brutal onslaught of so-called manifest destiny. Art historian Mary Peterson Zundo draws a connection between these historical circumstances and the evolving material basis of plains artistic practice. Quote, "Just as their pictures, once rendered on hide, adapted to the narrower confines of the rectangular page, communities of Cheyennes, Kiowas, and their allies found themselves squeezed into ever-shrinking territories," end quote. Implemented in 1887, the Dawes Act dictated the further division of Native American tribal landholdings into private allotments geared towards a new reign of subsistence farming at the expense of indigenous nomadic and communal land use traditions. In a prescient drawing made 10 years earlier, again, the Kiowa artist known as Woha visualizes the confrontation between these two cultures that would continue to color Plains life through and beyond the turn of the century, across what is sometimes known as the reservation and allotment eras. Woha had been captured at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1875 and imprisoned at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, where he was held until 1878. His captor, Captain Richard Pratt, provided him with drawing materials. Many of these were made for sale to tourists visiting the fort. This image presents Woha rooted between two miniaturized worlds, the neatly tilled plot of the settler's frame house on his right, and the dark silhouettes of a buffalo herd and a Kiowa teepee on his left. The mammals associated with these environments, a buffalo and a spotted longhorn bull, flank the artist. He offers a peace pipe to them both. In return, they provide him with their medicine or power, breathing it onto his head. It is a striking image in light of the fact that the agricultural environment required for cattle rearing is responsible for rampant habitat loss along the plains, destroying the ecosystem that was so crucial for buffalo. The sharply drawn ground line levels and connects them all, however, and although Woha turns to face the beef cow, he does not abandon the buffalo, receiving from it spiritual fortitude still. The landscape here is an even playing field, so to speak, aligning man, buffalo, and bull in constructive relationship. Kathleen Ash Milby of Navajo Nation, Janet Catherine Burlow, and other art historians of Plains drawings have noted how landscape only began to appear as a pictorial subject in the work of Native artists after they were removed from their communities. Woha's work is a testament to this development, But rather than propagating the acquisitive eye of settler artists who relegated landscape as possession and commodity, Woha presents reciprocal views in which human and non-human or more than human animals are enmeshed in an environment that safeguards their joint survival. In this way, he channels what Cree scholar Dwayne Donald has described as an indigenous philosophy of ethical relationality, which is first an enactment of ecological imagination. And ethical relationality is his term. This intertwinement of buffalo, people, and place extends across hide and paper, past and present, for Plains nations. 100 years after Woha's self-portrait, Salish artist John Quick-to-See Smith recognizes these relations through generative reversal or a rematerialization. In her Ronin Robe series, Smith practices a central part of Salish women's work, the soaking, scraping, tanning, and smoking of buffalo hide, but applies the process to cotton canvas. Her approach is intricate and, in her words, prayerful. She first cuts stretches of canvas into large skin shapes, washes them repeatedly to soften and fray the texture, dyes them with natural pigment, paints them with oil, covers them with melted beeswax, and finally smokes them over an open flame. Smith forges flesh out of fabric through ancestral processes and an act of alchemy that restores relation to the land through artistic transformation. Just as historical buffalo hide paintings called forth the landscape, the Ronin robes call it back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Remy, for that fantastic paper. And here I also want to maybe foreground how the kinds of ecological and more than human attunements, as well as the indigenous epistemologies that you are bringing into relief really resonate with some of the sensory methodologies from the first panel. Our second panelist today for this section is Kate Keohane, who is an associate lecturer in the history of art at the University of St. Andrews and earned her PhD there in 2020. Her research centers on post-colonial landscapes and their imbrications of personal identity and place. She's currently working on a monograph on the possibilities and problematics of the use of the theorist Edouard Glissant in art and exhibition practice. Her paper today, in fact, is Poetics of Relation, Edouard Glissant and Wilfredo Lam's Livre des Artistes.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Iggy, and thank you to the Courtauld team and to Elizabeth in particular, who's put a number of very complex ideas into relation. Remy, although not immediately obvious, our papers have a number of correspondences, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you at the end. Here we go. Towards the end of his life, the key theorist of relation, Edouard Glissant, devised a museum to actualize his theoretical interventions. Titled the Martinican Museum of the Arts of the Americas, and often abbreviated to M2A2, the institution was to be housed in an abandoned sugar factory in the country of his birth, Martinique, and to display the diversity of the arts of the Americas from the Mayas to the present. Glissant had begun to collect works to be displayed, including paintings by Wilfredo Lam, Augustin Cardena, and Roberto Matta, and the paintings and sculptures would have been shown within an archipelagic curatorial schema. Since around 2011, Glissant's conception of the archipelago, both as a literal space and as a theoretical system, has inspired numerous contemporary theorists and curators. As a term utilized most frequently by the prolific curator Hans-Ulrich Obrist, but which has yet to be sufficiently defined, archipelagic curation typically takes the form of a multitude of spaces without didactic route or narrative, which allows audiences to devise their own interpretations and to form their own connections and relations between objects and ideas. The term sits at the heart of Glissant's theoretical framework, which is often reduced to a series of tropes or theoretical signifiers that have been utilized as a toolkit for the display of visual arts, notably within Nicolas Bourriaud's relational aesthetics, Claire Bishop's participation, and the development of the structures of the Venice Biennial. Through archipelagic relation, the museum, M2A2, would have visualized Glissant's conception of relation and made manifest its significance for the field of visual art. But what is the significance of this museum never having come into being? In truth, Any of Glissant's artistic relationships associated with the Unrealized Museum or his artistic writings could be analysed in order to gain a further insight into the nature of Glissant's theories. But I propose that the work of Lam is primary amongst these. The importance of the relationship between Glissant and Lam has begun to be accounted for by Samia Kassab-Sharfi and recent texts by Samantha Noel, Francisco J. Hernandez-Adrian, and Jean Kalfa. But the theoretical possibilities of reading the two together has yet to be fully realized. By focusing on Lam's Livre des Artistes, we are offered a way of refiguring the relational systems that underpin both Glissant and Lam's work. These allow for imaginative interrogation of the way that writers, artists, and thinkers work together in the middle of the 20th century in a form of decolonial project, and how relation as a term can be utilized within the field of visual art up until the present day. As an artist who is central to Glissant's design of M2A2 and who fundamentally inspired his approach towards relationality, through the analysis of Lam's Livre des Artistes, it is possible to point to the specificities of Glissant's definition of relation, which is closely connected to his other theoretical terms, including, but not limited to, the archipelago, creolization, the trace, and opacity. Glissant defined and utilized the concept of relation in numerous ways throughout the course of his career, but the primary way in which he theorized the term was through an understanding of the circulation of ideas and objects in the world, defined by multiplicity and the impossibility of total knowledge or understanding. Relation therefore comes to form a sort of infinite circuit or chaotic rhizomatic non-system for conveying the changes and exchanges that occur as a result of global movements and exchanges. In a much quoted phrase written in 1990, Glissant defined the three interrelated functions of his famous concept of relation through three adjectives: linked, relayed, related. While the dense concept of relation has been thoroughly analysed by Glissantian critics, including Celia Britton, Peter Howard, and Sam Coombs, it is important to consider the spatial formations implied by these terms and the ways in which image and text form their own forms of relation. With this in mind, we see that relation is not a linear process, but rather one that involves flux and collective work, fundamentally premised on processes of return, in order to account for alternative approaches and histories experienced in the present tense. Through intersections and overlaps and analysis of the spaces in between text and image, it's possible to gain an insight into the specific mode of understanding the world that Glissant proposes. This is a consequence not only of Glissant and Lam working at a similar time and in similar creative and educational spaces, but also because of their particular political experiences and specific approach to the genre of landscape as both lived and imagined place and space. The literature that surrounds Lam is often bound up in biography and questions of origin or belonging. Born in Cuba in 1902 to a mother of African and Spanish descent and a Chinese father, Lam traveled to Europe in 1923 to further his artistic education. In the much documented journey of the freighter, the Capitaine Paul Lamar, in 1941, Lam fled from Marseille, France, to Cuba with around 300 fellow passengers and friends, including André Breton and Claude Lévi-Strauss, and the group was detained in Martinique because the Vichy government regarded them as traitors. It was during this period of detention that Lam and Breton met the Martinican poet Aimé Césaire, who had just written Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, in 1938. And Lam developed a printmaking practice, with his first Livre des Artistes being a collection of the book-length poem Fata Morgana by Breton towards the end of 1940. At this time, Aimé Césaire and his wife Suzanne were working on the journal Tropique, which featured poetry, criticism, and articles that combined the tenets of surrealism and radical politics, and frequently wrote that the foundation of a newly defined Antillean identity is situated in the soil, the nucleus of the landscape. Through their groundbreaking work, created both individually and collectively, the Césaires, Lam, and the anthropologist Lydia Cabrera, who translated the edition shown here, utilized surrealism as a means to critically engage in a transnational discourse. Glissant's novels, plays, poems, and theoretical writings work in relation to these thinkers in the truest sense, forming a reaction and resistance to ideas including Césaire's concept of negritude outlined within tropiques, whilst also adopting a shared approach to the significance of landscape, climate, and biotic materials. Born in 1928, Glissant was educated at Césaire School, the Lycée Victor Scolaire in Fort-de-France, and he immigrated to Paris in 1946, studying philosophy at the Sorbonne University and ethnology at the Musée de l'Homme, and became a prominent intellectual figure in around the 1950s. His ideas themselves were, of course, figured in relation to a number of contemporaneous thinkers, artists, and writers, notably including Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, as well as artists and poets that Glissant met through his presence at and collaboration with the Galerie de Dragon in Paris. In 1955, through association with this gallery, and notably during the period of the Cuban Revolution, Lam illustrated one of Glissant's early poems, La Terre Inquiète, or The Unquiet Earth, with 3 lithographs. The figures in the text images are hybrid beings that shift and morph across the pages of the book. The birds and horse head shapes so often attached to human figures in Lam's work represent the possession of a human by one of the deities mounting him or her during a trance in a Santeria ceremony, while the semi-ovoid shaped figures and totemic geometric forms express mysteries and movement that underlie Glissant's poems. These signs themselves were constantly transformed and recomposed in various ways, both in Lam's paintings and his broader collection of artist books, to convey by their deformations and reformations the different tensions or conflicts Lam aimed to express at particular points in his career. Rather than an illustration, the drawings form their own kind of narrative, one that does not clarify the meaning of the associated texts, but which rather expands and ruptures the language outwards into spaces of imagination and possible future creation. Glissant wrote that if, instead of the principles of perspective, Lam used contrasts of color to detach figures from backgrounds, it's because constructions organized in relation to a unifying eye were of no interest to him. Rather, Glissant contends that Lam aimed to represent the coexistence of different spaces, and importantly, parallel temporalities, which Glissant saw as a defining feature of the arts of the Americas. These ideas also underlie the poems that form La Terre Inquiète, which speak of paradoxical silences and chaotic clamoring, ruptures of sea and sky, rhizomatic roots, buried books, and terrified animals. It now pretty much goes without saying that particular modes of framing and staging the tropics have informed the ways in which the Caribbean islands are circulated within the global cultural imaginary. As outlined in Krista Thompson's paradigmatic text, An Eye for the Tropics, following the brutal landscaping processes of colonialism, tourism promoters perpetuated a particular view of the Caribbean as a fictive space or a terra firma. J. Michael Dash reminds us that this process of reinvention caused geographic space, landscape, and human communities to be inscribed with the rhetoric and images of given discursive practices. For Dash, the main biographer of Glissant, the fragility and openness of the broken chain of islands that make up the Caribbean archipelago make it susceptible to control. Yet I contend that through the intersection of text and image, or what Glissant termed a poetics of relation, the repeated landscape tropes or mysterious hybrid imagery utilized by both Lam and Glissant might function as a means of hiding in plain sight, while circulating as artists of the Americas. We're brought here to think about recent discussions surrounding Afrotropes and Samantha Noel's recent book of 2020, which describes this approach through the term tropical aesthetics. Noel argues that tropicality was an articulation of modernism that early 20th century Black artists employed to foster a sense of self-definition that was closely linked to a sense of belonging to the nation states they occupied in an effort to enact the naming of place. In line with Catherine McKittrick, she goes on to describe this radical political act as a way of making possible a sayability of geography that enabled agency. Tropical aesthetics thereby allowed these artists to visually articulate a different way of knowing and imagining the world. Yet, through connection with Glissant's concept of opacity, and indeed the mystical multi-layered forms represented within this celestial tropical scene shown here, which is part of Lam's last series of drawings, made to accompany a series of short stories by the art critic and writer Jean-Dominique Ray, I contend that relationality, often made manifest through landscape-based motifs, also allows for the expression of the unsayability and the unseeability of landscape. This takes place in three key ways. Firstly, within the literal process of the artist's book's creation, where in her account of the exiled surrealist, Martha Swain relays the fact that Lamb's then wife, Helena Holzer, would translate Breton's texts into Spanish as Breton wrote the poem, and Lamb would then select a passage that evoked an image for him and proceed to make drawings. Then, from perhaps the 36 drawings he made, 8 were selected for use in the book, thus causing the processes of translation and personal affiliation and experience to alter and shapeshift the emphasis and meaning through orality and immediate interpretation. And this is made even more acute in the Livre des Artistes, created with Giorgio Piglio in Milan, where the engraving studio devised a system to allow Lamb to express greater fluidity in his preferred form of printmaking, etching. As described by Laurie Stokes Sims in her analysis of the significance of Lamb's drawing, Studio Piglio made it so that Lamb could draw in bitumen powder sprayed onto copper plate with the support of a wooden bridge, so his arm could be suspended and move freely, and the effect can be seen most clearly in the fluidity and depth of the images created for Apostrophe Apocalypse by the poet Gerasim Luca, which I wish I could talk to you about more. Secondly, the opacities implied by poetic interpretation cause the works to evade location or reduction. Glissant writes that in Lamb, the pictorial form progressively becomes sign. And Esco Lamb, Lamb's son, noted in his preface to the Catalogue Raisonné of Lamb's prints that printmaking for my father was in so many ways the culmination of a lifelong relationship to poetry. Through the repetition of specific forms or ideas, perhaps reaching its apotheosis in Enunciation, which shows a cacophony of all of the forms seen before in Lamb's artist books, with subsequent poems written in response by César. Both Lamb and Glissant develop a non-system that relates as much to surrealism and magical realism as it does to Spanish Baroque poetry. This Baroque approach, rooted in complexity, multiplicity, and changeability, influenced what would culminate in Lamb's characteristic hybrid style and Glissant's susceptibility to the mores of contemporary curation. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the unsayability of landscape relates to the kinds of mythology that accompanied the homecoming from France to Cuba for Lamb, which is deemed so central to his artistic development. It must be remembered that Lamb was returning to a country that he had left nearly 20 years earlier, and that the experience of race in Cuba was quite different to that of pre-occupation Paris. Lamb would later say that he experienced the ostracism of fellow Cuban artists as a racist rejection and as a violent reaction to his recognition as a cosmopolitan artist. Within this, we see the problematics of relationality, premised on the impossibility of return to a singular state or way of being. As seen in this image, where the title of the associated poem translates to language, the tropic or tropical connection between different forms, tones, and reference causes relationality to function as a form of breakdown, of piecing together, of searching for searching's sake, without resorting to the delusions of discovery. The poetic and the political work together here, particularly if, in the spirit of Glissant's Poetic, we read this in multiple languages and translations. Relation then accounts for the impossibilities and ambivalences expressed in opacities and challenges the universals presumed in notions of identity and landscape belonging. And so we are brought back to notions of archipelagic curation and Glissant's unrealized museum. Lamb and Glissant experienced the archipelago both as a symbol of infinite connectivity and creativity, and as a bordered space that they were held in and rejected from. Archipelagic curation and Glissantian readings of visual art, in line with the aims of M2A2, therefore have to be understood as collaborative relational systems founded upon the privileges of international movement and the knotty and chaotic experiences of return. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate, for a fantastic paper. And in particular, I loved the really rich visual and linguistic lexicon that you provide for thinking not just about the kind of hybrid forms of relationality, but also forms of relationality that bind concretely lived experience to the purely potential, to potential horizons that have yet to be realized. As a reminder, we are taking questions for our speakers in chat, so you can write them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of our panel. Our final panelist for this section is Siobhan Angus. Siobhan Angus specializes in the history of photography and the environmental humanities with a focus on materiality, perceptions of nature, and environmental justice. She holds a PhD in art history and visual culture from York University and is currently a Banting postdoctoral fellow in the history of art and a visiting scholar at the Yale Center for British Art. Her research has been published in Panorama, Radical History of Review, and Capitalism, and the edited collection Camera, and is forthcoming in Geohumanities in October. Her paper today is called Embodiment, Deindustrialization, and Environmental Justice in LaToya Ruby Fraser's On the Making of Steel Genesis. Sandra Goldford.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Iggy, for the introduction, and to Elizabeth for organizing everything today, as well as to the team at the Courtauld. It's wonderful to be following Remy and Kate, as I think there's some really productive overlaps between our papers. I'm presenting today from the unceded territories, stewarded by the Lenni Lenape, known as Philadelphia, while the virtual yet very material infrastructure linking us is based in the traditional territory of the Ohlone in what is now San Jose. So today, through a case study of LaToya Ruby Fraser's cyanotype photographs of the steel industry in America's Rust Belt, I want to theorize relationality from the perspective of the environmental humanities. So to do so, I make three sort of conceptual moves. First, I propose a material connection by doing an eco-critical reading of these images, which situates cultural production as an interplay between extractive and artistic labor, materials, and histories. Secondly, I propose a porousness or instability between the image, the material, the landscape, and the human body. And I use this to think through embodiment in the context of environmental justice. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I want to think about relationality vis-a-vis extraction. This is really a case study of extraction, of steel mining and refining, and how these large-scale industrial processes transformed ecosystems, communities, and human bodies. So extraction is the action of removing something. There's a connotation of force. But extraction also provides the raw materials that give our world form, the materials that make the photographic print or the smartphone in your pocket. Extraction is also a worldview that understands both nature and many forms of labor as a resource to be expropriated. Extractive capitalism, colonization, and white supremacy enact these processes of extraction, expropriation, and dispossession, which are then symbolically affirmed in culture. So people, communities, and landscapes are made sacrificable in the context of an accumulation-based society. Extraction is also a way of engaging with others. The often extractive nature of photography as a medium is reflected in the language of photography. You aim, take, or shoot the camera. Extractive practices are also common in academic work. And in light of that, I want to acknowledge that my analysis today is rooted in indigenous theories of reciprocity by scholars like Zoe Todd and Warren Carriou, as well as Michelle Murphy's work on toxicity, Glissant's essential work, and relational approaches to photography by scholars like Tina Kampt and Ariella Azoulay. So today, I really want to position relationality against extraction to suggest it might be an alternative. And I argue that an emphasis on relationality enacts a decentering of extractive processes by introducing an ethics of care which confronts the extractive gaze of neoliberal austerity that renders lives, landscapes, and histories disposable. So shifting from extractive and accumulation-based practices invites relationship building, reciprocity, and centering responsibility and solidarities to each other. And this, I argue, is what Fraser's work does. So first, I want to think about material. Consider a series of 4 portraits that capture the artist LaToya Ruby Fraser in motion, superimposed over a flat, dark blue background. The portraits are documentation from a 2012 performance piece titled "If Everybody's Work is Equally Important?" held outside the Levi's store in Soho, New York. In her piece, she rubs her body on the sidewalk, wearing out a pair of jeans. The portraits borrow a visual vocabulary from mid-century steel industry advertisements and evoke Edmund Weebridge's cyanotype proofs of his movement studies. The most obvious thing to say about the images is that they are very blue. The Prussian blue coloration doubles the symbolic reference to blue-collar work evoked in the head-to-toe denim uniform. But these prints make a clear link between materiality and meaning, as they use iron as a light-sensitive material to create prints that illuminate histories of steel communities. And steel is an alloy of iron. Cyanotypes were invented by Sir John Herschel, who developed a method of printing photographs that used the light-sensitive salts of iron rather than silver. These iron-based printing methods are known as siderotypes. Unlike silver, iron to oxalate requires a secondary reaction to make a permanent print. In this case, forming a pigment such as Prussian blue. As an element, iron is present in human bodies, plants, photographic prints, and infrastructure. Iron is a mineral necessary for human health, linked to growth and metabolism. But the industrial processes of refining iron introduce industrial toxins and mineral imbalances into bodies, causing disease. And as Fraser's practice reveals, these same chemicals that cause harm are also used as light-sensitive materials to document these practices and processes. So it's through this symbolic connection between the materiality of the image and its subject matter that they show us something profound about how our world is made. Fraser is a native of Braddock, Pennsylvania, the home of the steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie's first steel mill, the Edgar Thomson Steel Works. Braddock is located in what we would now call the Rust Belt, the former industrial cities of America's Northeast. The decline of the industrial sector in the last quarter of the 20th century was accompanied by economic decline, population loss, and urban decay. So the Rust Belt uses a material metaphor, the corrosion that happens to iron as it's exposed to the elements. So these former industrial centers have metaphorically turned to rust. Fraser has a personal connection to this history. One of the workers in Carnegie's steel mill was Fraser's grandfather, one of the few African-American workers employed in the mill. So Fraser's piece is responding to a 2010 ad campaign by Levi Strauss that featured Braddock to highlight a line of Levi's workwear. Levi's cast residents from Braddock to star in the ads under the slogans "Ready to Work," "Everybody's work is equally important," and "We are all workers." So Fraser rejects Levi's romanticization of Braddock as a post-industrial frontier, full of opportunity for, quote, people to seize the land and build their lives. The concept of the frontier evokes Terra Nullius and the doctrine of discovery, which provided a justification for the seizure of indigenous territory in the Americas. In Ready to Work, a voiceover narrates, "Maybe the world breaks on purpose so that we can have work to do." The ad concludes by suggesting that Braddock is simply another frontier waiting to be opened up, reinscribing extraction. The ad reflects a larger cultural fascination with ruin porn, aestheticized images of industrial sites in states of disrepair. As McLean Clutter writes, ruins, like photographs, are indexical and are seen as having a privileged relationship to the real. So these images promise a working class authenticity to people who feel increasingly alienated, an authenticity that can be bought by blue jeans. And deindustrialization itself is kind of accompanied by a type of disembodiment, a decentering of the worker and their labor, a sense of being physically left behind. So in contrast to the ruin porn aesthetic, Fraser places her body in front of the viewer in an insistence on the ongoing history in these post-industrial spaces, using her body to ground the vast abstraction of deindustrialization in an insistence on embodiment. Secondly, I argue that Fraser's embodied portraits materialize the porous boundaries between body, industry, and elements, revealing unstable boundaries between nature and culture. Here, returning to the materiality of the print is instructive. The iron that chemically interacted with light to produce the distinct shade of blue in cyanotypes is in many ways removed from the extractive history of iron. The prehistory of cyanotypes lies in an accidental ferment in an alchemist lab in Berlin in the early 16th century. Johann Jacob Diesbach, a pigment maker, shared a workspace with Johann Conrad Dippel, an alchemist working on an elixir of life. While making the pigment Florentine Lake, Diesbach brought potash from Dippel that was contaminated by an oil produced through the destructive distillation of bones. So the chemical reaction that produced Prussian blue came from organic materials, blood, hide, hair, feathers, horn, hooves, or flesh. So a decidedly bodily prehistory. And Fraser's work is a powerful testimony to bodies, to industrial illness, engaging with damage, toxicity, and disposability. Fraser reflects that the history of a place is written on the body of its inhabitants and their environment. Often in my photographs, whether it's a landscape of a house or an aerial view of railroads or a steel mill, I see the landscape as a portrait of the body. And the struggle for access to healthcare is particularly heightened in places like Braddock, due to the high levels of disease in the region caused by polluted soil, air, and water. Fraser's work makes toxicity tangible while resisting damage-based narratives that lead to disposability. These toxic entanglements are made visible in Fraser's 2011 video, Detox Braddock, which films Fraser and her mother doing a detox that pulls heavy metals out of the pores of their feet. Fraser reflects, "I carry Braddock in my body. I have so much metal in my blood from living in that town. My body is that town." So the legacies of environmental toxicity and systemic racism directly impact the health of people who live in environmental sacrifice zones. And it's through this focus on the body that Fraser introduces these questions of environmental justice. In doing so, it productively engages with toxicity and damage by making visible the systems and structures that created environmental crisis, rather than reinscribing damage or pathologizing the land or bodies. In 2017, Fraser took large format cyanotype portraits of Sandra Gould Ford in her backyard. In one of them, Gould Ford is in the center of the frame and looks directly at the camera, encircled by lush foliage. The portrait is from the series Steel Genesis that focuses on Gould Ford, a working class Black woman who worked as a secretary and clerk at the Jones and Laughlin Steel Company in Pittsburgh until the factory closed in 1985. The project is a collaboration between Fraser and Gould Ford. It is profoundly relational. Steel Genesis includes Fraser's portraits alongside photographs that Gould Ford took, which capture the day-to-day realities in industrial landscapes. So in contrast to the modernist forms of the industrial sublime, this visual language based on the power and dynamism of industry, Gould Ford's photographs are quotidian. Gould Ford also archived photographs from JNL. Fraser scanned the documents and reproduced them as cyanotypes on a manual plate maker at Pittsburgh Filmmakers. The juxtaposition of images shows the idealized corporate vision alongside the reality. This includes accidents, insurance claim settlements, and workplace safety concerns. And through this juxtaposition, Fraser highlights the gap between corporate communications and lived realities. Fraser's portraits show Gould Ford in a multifaceted way. They acknowledge her status as a worker without reducing her identity down to it. The inclusion of Genesis in the title positions steelmaking as a metaphor for people forging their lives and identities. What Gould Ford describes as a process of constantly coming into being, constantly evolving. Similarly, portraiture functions as a space of self-construction by allowing the subject to present as they want to be seen. The webs of relationality that Fraser weaves centers an ethics of care that offers us a way to materially engage with the problem of extractive pollution in a way that enacts responsibility and relationality as an alternative to disposability and damage. Fraser's work contests the erasure of blue-collar workers in Pennsylvania, but she does not idealize industrial work either. Rather, what the photographs reveal is the larger working of both extractive and neoliberal capitalism. They show us how our world is made, and they function as testimony in the context of environmental injustice, while forming an indictment of the neoliberal politics of abandonment. Her photographs of working class life in the Rust Belt make the links between bodies, industry, deindustrialization, and unequal access to healthcare tangible or material. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. And as a reminder, please put your questions to our panelists in chat, and I'll make sure to get with them. So we have a little bit more than, I think, 10 minutes for Q&A. So hopefully we'll have a really engaged and lively discussion. But let me maybe start off and kind of draw some connections between these really rich papers. I'll start off with Siobhan's, and one of the aspects of the paper that I wanted to kind of foreground is how you remind us in a way that really resonates, I think, with Remy's and Kate's projects, how an ethics of care, how capacious forms of relationality are not just resistive to violent forms of relationality, but are also intimately implicated in them at the same time. There's a kind of oscillation between violence and care that I think really runs through all of your papers, particularly when we're thinking about questions of race and settler colonialism, thinking also about the institutional conditions under which art appears, right? Its adjacency to, forms of extractive violence, and also often writing against kind of ossified or calcified epistemologies that obstruct have obstructed so many different communities and art practices for so long. And I think this was really kind of richly realized across your different papers, despite their very unique concerns. Before we get to some other questions, there's still some other threads that I also wanted to draw into relief as a kind of commons grounds, perhaps, for our discussion. The first is that this panel was ostensibly about landscapes, but of course, the question of landscape really opened up to what we might think of as the ecological in its environmental, geopolitical, and affective valences that really kind of binds all of your concerns together. And this allows us to think of forms of relationality that are more than human, that are tied to not just intersubjective modes of recognition, perhaps the most conventional form of thinking about relationality, but that also exceeds, intention, subjectivity, right? A kind of reminder of moments of non-self-possession or non-self-sovereignty, shall we, in conceptualizing how people and how art practices are interrelated. And to this end, you all provide different categories, different terms for thinking about this. Remy cited the question of totality, a totality without totalization, the question of the archipelago, and Siobhan's paper, this aspect of permeability, I think all speak to this dynamic at the heart of your concerns. And also, I think running across all of your papers, there was also this notion of unseeability, right? So maybe also a way to think about the resonance between this panel and the first panel of kind of forms of practice, forms of articulation that have been deemed unseeable or unintelligible based on perhaps kind of colonial paradigms of recognition that these works actively try to induce. So those are just some, I think, points of correspondence that might just kind of anchor where we are, for this Q&A. So let me start with a question. Just let me pivot. So the first question comes from Jennifer Doyle, and it's regarding the poetics and politics of time. So this is open to all of the panelists, but would any of you like to speak to how history, time, chronopoetics figures in your work if it does? So I'll leave this open for whoever wants to take it.
I wonder if I could start, because mine is maybe the easiest. This is the most central idea to Glissant's theorizations, the way that histories are experienced within the present tense, and that the rejection of perhaps a Western colonial view of history and a linear trajectory where his time and historical events are brought back into singular events that are listed in a chronological order, and thinking about its polyvalency and multiple overlaps, and the kind of surreal experience of personal encounter where memories and fantasies come in at once.
Yeah, I can build on that. Just thank you so much, Kate and Siobhan. I'm so honored to be on this panel with you all. My mind is brimming with connections, and I love the porousness that Siobhan brought up, because I feel like that's activated very much so through these presentations. So yeah, I'm so glad that time, politics and poetics of time came up, and especially in regards to perceptions of place and the relation of place to time and to history. That is of profound significance to Lakota. My specialization is in Lakota culture, and for those communities, time, we see this again and again, anchored in geography, not in events or linearity, like Kate brought up. And I love this idea of the process of return that you invoked with Glissant and Lamb, relationality not operating as a linear process, that being so crucial, and how return can, this process of return can be elicited by the landscape. And I'm thinking specifically of Vine Deloria Jr., a Standing Rock Sioux intellectual and activist, who in his profound text, God is Red, he writes about how a sacred geography in a Lakota construct conflates history and geography, such that, quote, every location within their original homeland has a multitude of stories that recount the migrations, revelations, and particular historical incidents that cumulatively produced a tribe in its current condition. And so he's really distinguishing this between how, for Western perspectives, quote, God works in history, that is to say in events, not in people and places. And I think, we see how that evacuation of place by Western scholars when working with when studying Plains pictorial practice is a way to disrupt that historical continuity towards, settler machinations and ends. So sorry, that was sort of a lot of words, but I hope some of that lands. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for this great question. I have, I guess, maybe a specific answer and then a more general answer. The first is that I think what Fraser's work does so powerfully really centers on time, right? She takes this durational analysis to slow violence. And as we know, slow violence is one of those things that evades vision, that's impossible to see. And these are histories that we've also, mass culture has chosen not to see, right, to turn away from. And this sort of durational analysis of thinking about her body, her mother's body, and her grandmother's body as a way of putting these histories on her own terms back into public view. And she also uses this method in her photographs of Flint with another family, right? It's this idea of something generational. And so I think that there's something in that connection to time that might get at something a little bit more complicated. And this is part of a larger project that I'm working on, which looks at kind of early 19th century photographic processes and their, very material extractive histories, and how artists in the present are using these methods as a way of kind of opening up these historical moments that I think were very impactful in terms of, the global spread of capitalism, the rise of anthropogenic climate change, many of the histories that we're dealing with very actively right now. And it seemed interesting to me that so many artists whose work I admire, like Warren Carreau or Susanna Creeman or LaToya Ruby Fraser, were taking this very material approach to time and temporality through this use of different products or processes. And so, Fraser's work I read alongside Anna Atkins' cyanotypes, which in some ways, is not an obvious pairing, but through the materiality, then you get this linking of, England as it's rapidly industrializing, and this sort of kind of strange taxonomical project that's engaging with photography and amateurism and female botany alongside Fraser's work on deindustrialization. So I think that sometimes thinking materially also shows us slightly different things about time, which can be really productive.
Great. And apologies in advance if I don't get to all of the questions. We do want to end on time so that we can have our break between. So maybe we have the final question, and it's from Catherine Lavender. So this is for all the panelists again, so maybe we can hear briefly from all the panelists. In a number of ways, your meditations here in landscape might better be thought of as place-based art that is connected to a location that is actual and also ideological. Thoughts on that? So from time to place. And let's volley it back to the speakers. Maybe we could begin with Kate, since we started with you last time, if that's fair.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. That's a tricky question because I actually believe that it's better to think about landscape. So thinking about place as a lived environment that objects and images and experiences circulate within, and landscape as a construction. The word derives from landscape or landschappa, literally to shape the land, and recognizing that the way that the world around us is staged through a series of tropisms or easily recognizable landscapes is really important to what I'm thinking about with these works, and unpicking the signs and the ways that we can reutilize those images to understand our place and space, and the way that the landscape is experienced as setting, scene, and site or site is very important. So place comes within the landscape, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for my paper, for my thinking around this topic, place has been critical, but I think it's helpful to delineate between these terms, landscape versus place, versus environment versus ecosystem. We can spend much time deliberating between those, but I think for me it was helpful in pulling away from the idea of place being absent or landscape being, because if we only consider landscape as the guarantor or locale of place or a connection to environment in a work of art, then this insistence on its absence in many Indigenous pictorial practices is one of violence and evacuation. So that's where to think that one could approach these hide paintings and suggest that there was no sense of place involved in these works when, the very anatomical ground of them is so tethered to that that environment. It just didn't add up to me. So that's where my project has come from, and of course, place being of crucial ontological importance for Indigenous communities of spiritual understanding and connections. And Dwayne Donald, who was a Cree scholar I quoted around ethical relationality, that being, taking our cues from the ecosystem and that those shared connections and recognizing humanity or more than humanity as being a vehicle towards these ethics of care that Siobhan brought up, that is of profound importance. So I just want to say I really also love the idea of positioning relationality in opposition to extractivism and extractive economies. And I just would love to talk more offline about that. I know we're short on time now, but thank you so much for invoking that, Siobhan.
Yeah, I will just briefly agree with all of these comments. But yeah, I think a lot about like land and place, not necessarily landscape. I think especially in photography, which often sort of enacts processes of abstraction just through the nature of the medium itself. I think that when thinking about extraction, these very material processes, it's really important to think about the kind of material histories, the histories of property that exist in those places, and then the histories that predate extraction and will outlive extraction, I hope, that are much more kind of spiritual or reveal connection to place. So I think that it's just always really helpful to keep it in mind that those two things are not necessarily equivalent, right? Place and landscape. So thank you for that question.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think this is a great place to end so that we can take a break. We will be back at 7:15. So just letting everybody know. And thanks again to all the panelists for the great papers and all of the fantastic questions. Thank you all.